Hello, hello, friends. We are back. Hello there. So I hope everyone is doing well. I decided to do something a little bit different. And, because first, this topic was long due. It's not overdue, but long due. And I think it's quite an interesting one considering what has been going on. I decided to just start simple. So now, for example, I'll just put myself out of the screen for just 2 seconds. This is definitely a the flag that's definitely been giving a lot of talk these days, and particularly this last month. Although that topic has not been restricted to the last month, it's actually a discussion that has been going on for years. It's like the question of who was first, the egg or the chicken, kind of, to simplify it. Well, this flag you're seeing it is the flag of Palestine, or of the state of Palestine, should we said it. And the reason I brought this particular topic because like like any topics I could get, like I just picked them out from a giant box, that giant big box of Pandora I have, and out of the so many topics, I decide, okay, this one yes, this one maybe not. And this one is definitely worthy and interesting considering what has been happening. So, for those of you who are perhaps not very familiar with the issue, and I think that this one is obviously a tricky and a complicated issue, there still are ways to explore this in, I would say, a quite fair, simple way. So you don't need to have like a very strong opinion. You don't need to read 40 articles or that stuff. But let's say that at least you can grasp a bit of what's taking place and eventually why this can eventually become somehow important. Um, because obviously I care about what I'm going to eat tomorrow and all those things, and the groceries I need to stop to purchase. But sometimes I also think about these issues, and they can somehow affect our lives in a way or another, especially concerning values. So basically, what has been happening in this past month of September, there have been some, let's say, um, some political high level discussions about recognizing a new state, and well, the state of Palestine. And you might say, okay, a state, what basically is a state? Well, a state is basically probably where you live in. And if you live in a place where you're subjected to some form of uh, political authority, uh, with a territory and with a population greater than yourself, it's not just your home, you're living with other people in communities, then there's a very high likelihood you're living in a state. And that's the essential elements of the state. So basically it's like a territory where people live in, because a state is not, it cannot be separated from society. It's not like you don't have a state in like other biological creatures. It's not like you probably have communities in between animals. They make their own communities from, I don't know, fishes, even octopuses. They say they can actually lay the foundations and kind of like establish cities. And there are animals who actually live in groups, right? Like I say the monkeys, the gorillas, the chimpanzees. To some extent, they're social, right? So they form these groups and communities. But in the case of humans, it's just not enough to just have communities. But in any case, a state, it is linked to a community of people living together. So it's not a community of fishes, a community of gorillas, although some definitely look like, but I'm not talking about those. It is a community of people living together, at least physically, in the physical sense. So as a group of people are living in a territory where there is a political entity, basically an authority, someone who has control over who comes in, uh, who comes out, who is allowed to stay in that state, and what kind of things and activities you can do or you cannot do in that state, in that place. So you cannot have a territory in the absence of any of these three. You cannot have a state without a territory. You need a physical land, but it's not just the territory in terms of land of terra firma. So it's not the soil you walk in. It can be a territory in aerial space. It can be territory in uh, sea or aquatic territory, so underwater, and even some even call it within the space area, whatever. Basically, uh, you generally have this division of a territory in airspace, land, and sea, or land and water. This is where you have a certain territory, and in that territory, you can have a group of people lives together, and they are subjected, or they agree that they are subjected to a certain authority, the political authority. Now, how exactly that authority is, we don't know. It's something. It's like it's that shit. Eh, I just call it in simple terms because that authority, we don't care about how it's established, if it comes from elections, if it comes from uh, any sort of imposition, any sort of monarchy, hierarchical like lineage. You don't see that. It's what matters is that there is an entity that exercises that control, and this is how you establish a state. Okay, so far so good. You need these three things, you might say: the territory, the people living in the territory, and the political authority. Okay, that's simple. But then there comes the question: how do I know that? Let's say 20 people decide to establish themselves in an island, and they say, okay, now this, we have like a leader there in the island, and now this is a state, the state of Tumba Tumba, let's call it. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. And the problem is, who cares of what happens in the state of Tumba Tumba if you're just in a lonely island in the middle of nowhere and there's nobody and no contacts with the outside. And that's exactly the point of our topic. We need not just these three elements, but a new fourth one. Okay, well, so what's the new sauce? New sauce is you need international recognition. Yeah, it's not enough for a group of people to say, okay, we're establishing the state. There's this guy here who leads us, and we agree that he exercises his authority over the island, and he decides who comes in, who comes out, and what kind of things we do in the island. Yeah, so far so good, but that only the island will have to interact with other islands. So let's say that this Tumba Tumba island uh, has three other islands: uh, Tumba 1, Tumba 2, and Tumba 3, let's call it, to make it even more simple. And these islands, like the people who live there, same way, it's like they constitute themselves a state, but somehow they have a grievance towards Tumba Tumba, and no, they just don't want to recognize it. They say no, they just stink. The people in that island just stink. We don't like stinky people, and so we don't recognize that community of stinky people, and much less a state constituted by those stinky people. Kind of. I'm knowing I'm oversimplifying it, but let's keep it in this way. And that's exactly how just creating a state by itself is not enough for that state to exist per se. So it's not like a belief. Well, you say a belief is like, okay, I believe in this. But that belief is not subject to other people agreeing or not agreeing to that belief. It's just you have that belief. But for the state, the existence of a state does not depend upon just a group of people agreeing on that state. It's not about forcing that. You need other people to, like, especially those who do not belong to that state, to agree for that state. Because if they don't, and no way to force them out, it's something that either they voluntarily agree or they don't. Because if they don't, you basically will not be credible and your state will not be recognized. So it's the same as there is no state. So in the case of our unfortunate inhabitants of Tumba Tumba, they'll basically not be recognized as part of a Tumba Tumba state. You know, they just say, okay, those are people in a territory. If they go to Tumba 1, Tumba 2, or Tumba 3, they will say, no, um, these are just people and they live in that territory, but we don't recognize anything to that territory. And then there comes the big question. Okay, if they don't recognize the state of Tumba Tumba, what will happen? Let's say that Tumba 1 is greedy and wants to establish their presence. And they start to make maps and they say that Tumba Tumba Island belongs to them. But Tumba Tumba, seeing what Tumba 1 was doing, and say, no, no, that belongs actually to us because of some other excuse. And Tumba 3, also seeing the same of Tumba 2 and Tumba 1, they do the same. And that can lead to a problem because the people that live in the so-called Tumba Tumba Island, they will be subject to problems. Because now their would-be state, which is not recognized, of Tumba Tumba, now you have three entities, Tumba 1, Tumba 2, and Tumba 3, disputing uh, who has the political control over that territory. And you know what that leads? It can lead to fights. So you have now Tumba 1, Tumba 2, and Tumba 3 fighting over who controls what over the Tumba Tumba inhabitants. Well, that sounds a bit of abstract, right? And we have a similar kind of issue that is happening with the people that live in the so-called now territory of Palestine. And now this is where the rabbit hole grows deeper. This state of Palestine, well, some have decided to recognize it earlier in the international community, because here we're not just talking about a bunch of islands, we're talking about other countries. So the state recognition usually comes in the form of other existing states recognizing new states. It's kind of like, okay, you want to become a state. If other people in the club agree with that, it's fine. It's fine. And then you might ask, then how many people you need in the club to agree for that particular entity to be a state? Do you need 20, 40, 2? What is exactly the number, the right number? There is no particular rule on that, but I would say a common sense rule is once you start being accepted by a large number of community states, of states around of the existing states, then it just likely means that that state is recognized. So for the case of Palestine, you really know that there definitely has to be some state of Palestine, uh, because a lot of countries within the world are now recognizing it. So this is how you come to the evidence, or like say the conclusion, that Palestine must be a state. In the same way that, for example, you see other countries, so let's say established countries like US or the United Kingdom or China, right? So you have these countries and you instantly recognize them as states, as countries, the typical name that you use. And you recognize that because what happens is that the community, not just people in general, but the community of states already agree that these territories, they have uh, they have communities under a political authority. They agree on that, or they at least have to recognize that, and they are recognized by any other country, or the majority of countries. And this is how they come to the existence that there are countries there. That, for example, China is a country, that the US is a country, a state. Country, state is like used interchangeably, or the United Kingdom is a country or state. This is how basically you can infer that, okay, an entity is a state. But then you might say, yeah, but okay, you quoted a few examples of states that kind of like are recognized, and there's no problem with that. And yeah, that's the problem, because some states are like immediately recognized either by because they have like a huge army, because they have like a long history, all those things, or a combination of those. But when a country is new, when a country is new, or like you're the new guy that comes to the club of states, you really have to fight more to say, hey, I'm new here, I'm a new state, I really am a state. But so you have to kind of like to explain, you have to make your point of view heard, that you really are a state, that you are credible, so that the other states already existing in the place, in this case in our planet, agree in your statehood quality. So this is exactly the path that Palestine has been doing. Uh, they just did not become a state overnight. Uh, they still have not been recognized by everybody in the world, by every state in the world. But you don't need to be recognized by every freaking state in the world for you to exist as a state. You just need a large number. And by large, this is an indeterminate quantity. You don't need to have a specific number to be recognized. You just need to have a large quantity of members of, let's say, of states in the international community to recognize that entity as a state. So let's say if the world would be made of 200 countries, and you have like at least 120 agreeing that there is a state there, then probably there is. And it's not just because there are 80 countries remaining who decides to just dodge the question or pretend that there isn't a country, or because they don't like a country, that said country does not exist. And this is where I tell you that the international recognition is not subject the international recognition criteria for a state is not an unanimous thing. You don't need to be recognized by every single state in the world, because otherwise, if there would be like a state or a group of states which would not want a particular community to create their own state, they would say no, we cannot accept that state to exist. That's an aberration. That's just heresy or something like that. And we know that this is just unrealistic and stupid. This is impractical. You don't need to have a unanimous recognition by everybody. Hell, you don't need to be liked by everybody. Like with people, you know you're not going to be liked by everyone. So the same applies to states. States are not here for them to be liked by everybody. They're not your personal clowns. They're there. They have their own interests. Like any person has its interests, and like any normal functional person, I think your goal is not to please everything and everybody, unless you're a professional clown, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the so-called normal people. And the same happens with the states, or the so-called normal states. They don't exist for you to be liked by them. If you like them, good, yeah, okay. They might even have their public relation things so that they're appreciated by people naturally, but they're not there for you to like them. They are not there to please you. You're not the main. Uh, you're not. It's like it doesn't matter how many tantrums you put. The states have their interest, and you are not the number one priority. Yes, they might care for the interest of their people, and they have their own priorities, but they don't they don't have as priority uh, making sure that you love them. That's not their priority. Okay, that's just one thing about the states. So Palestine, in the same manner, doesn't need to please every other state in the world to be accepted as a state. It just needs the approval of a large community, whatever that large number is, unspecified, of states to agree that Palestine is indeed a state. So it's like, okay, you're going to ask a few countries, and they say, okay, do you recognize Palestine goes to one of those countries said, do you recognize me, Palestine, as this state? And they say, yeah, okay, we do recognize. Okay, that's an international recognition. But then I'm talking about states like people, right? States are not people. Exactly, they're abstract entities, abstract in the way that that they're not physical. They're like a representation of things. They're abstract. You see a flag, but that's the flag is just a representation of like an image, an association to something that is kind of abstract. Flags, well, yes, we're used to see countries with flags, but that's just another element. And here with Palestine, as I was saying, what matters is how do we obtain this international recognition from another state? Well, states, unfortunately, they need people, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, you might say. And those people are like the means that actually represent the interests of a state. So you have, like, for example, uh, could have France, you could have Germany, you could have, uh, I don't know, Egypt, countries, states. And those states, how do they exist? How do they operationalize their will? They need their own in order for their interests to be exercised, in order for their purposes to be achieved, they need people like representatives and an authority that carries the means to execute those wills. They have the purpose to enforce what is the interest of the state or the interests of the state. And so you have a group of people generally representing or that materialize what is the aim of that state or the actions of a state. Because a state cannot by itself recognize another state. It is the representatives, the political authorities of that state that issue the recognition of another state. And you might actually say, so they don't even recognize another state, but they recognize another state. And this means that they need to talk to representatives of the so-called state they want to be recognized. So, and in the international, like, diplomacy, so to speak, the the diplomacy of states to states or states who are recognizing aspiring states, you always have people. On the one hand, the representatives of the state of the existing states who are to accredit, um, who are to confirm that a new state exists, and on the other hand, you have the representatives of the aspiring state. And these are the people who expect their new state to be recognized by other states, particularly by the representatives of such states. And this is basically how the recognition process works. Now, there are different authorities, and sometimes, there's just a competent set of political authorities within each country that is responsible for recognizing the existence of states. Of course, if you are like the top leader of the country, that counts as a recognition. Usually, that's the formal process. You have like the the top chief of the country. No matter how he's got there, you just have the top chief in the country. And when that state wants to recognize another, you generally have the top chief of that country formally making a statement and recognizing that the aspiring state is indeed a state. So, for example, in the case of Palestine a few days ago, it could be um, like France stepping up, the president of France, and saying, we formally recognize the existence of the state of Palestine, for example. The United Kingdom did the same in its own ways during this month. But we're going to watch that later. The thing is, this recognition process is done by people. So we already have discussed a few things. First, what is a state, or the elements, the critical three elements that you need in a state? The need also for the international recognition of that state, and the fact that states cannot operate per se without people. So you need people to represent the interests of the state, and that the recognition process of the states involves existing states and the representatives of such states, including like the top chiefs and the aspiring states representatives. Palestine, as an aspiring state, generally you might say, well, they need their own representatives, right? Because if they want to parlay with other existing states, they need to um, they need to have their own representatives, right? Because then if they would be going like to, let's say if they would be going to France or the United Kingdom, I'm talking about in the very beginning, like 20 years ago, then a very question that the France or the United Kingdom representatives could say is, okay, and where are the representatives of Palestine? What with which people are we talking? Which and it's not just anybody from Palestine or from the would-be territory of Palestine. You need people with authority. So it's like people, the so-called representatives of Palestine, because it just cannot be anybody. And it's not just a matter of popularity. They need to be recognized as authority, uh, as a group of people that really have political decision capacity and they have authority and they're recognized within that territory. So for the Palestinian representatives, it would mean that the so-called Palestinian people within the so-called Palestinian territory would need to have a group of people which they place authority and political legitimacy or the means to negotiate and bargain with other people. So basically, they have to recognize a representative of the Palestinian Authority. And these are basically the political authorities or the political powers of the aspiring Palestinian state. That's exactly what has been going on for decades. It was the question of who was or not legitimate representatives of the so called Palestinian aspiring state. But let's just nail it down. Let's just assume that, okay, the existing countries now they know who they need to talk to when they're regarding the issue of the recognition of the state of Palestine. They already know uh, which political authorities they are to contact for the recognition of the state of Palestine. Then it becomes much easier because now the existing states and their political authorities, knowing the kind of entities, the kind of political authorities that represent the would be aspiring Palestinian states, then it becomes easy to establish a recognition. So it's not just, okay, there's a bunch of people in a territory and there's a bunch of political factions. You also need to have a group that exercises political authority there that is recognized not just by the so-called aspiring state, that is the Palestinian Authority recognized by the Palestinian people, but also an authority that is recognized abroad. Because otherwise, it's like, you know, even if a political authority is like appreciated, even if it is liked within that territory, it becomes irrelevant if it is not subjected to any form of recognition or legitimacy recognition from outside. Because as I would say, there's domestic consumption and there's abroad consumption. Now, generally, you might say, okay, but if that entity, if a political entity has a de facto control over that territory, or at least it is recognized as a political authority by the groups of people that live in that territory, then it should probably be recognized by other states or by uh, other nations, right? The answer is generally yes, but not necessarily, because there's the question of legitimacy. Because, for example, imagine that there's in a particular territory with a group of people again, and there's a new leader that comes because of a coup d'etat or some of these strong military maneuvers. They come, they usurp the power, and they establish themselves as the rulers of said country. Well, the people in that country, because the political authority came in by force, and he has the force to impose himself over those people, They might just have to acknowledge that, okay, yes, we have a new chief and we accept it because he has the force. And he who has the force, he's the one who can make the laws, kind of. So they recognize it. But the fact that the people within that territory recognize that political authority as their representative, because such authority has like force control, arms control, or whatever it has, military control, that does not mean that such political authority will be recognized outside. In fact, there is a great chance and likelihood that if that political authority jumped to power by coup d'etat and by force, by using weapons and threats, most likely there will be a great number of countries in the international community will not recognize the legitimacy of such countries, unless, of course, they're friends with the so-called political coups and they have interests or they have other alliances, whatever. But generally, the countries who have like their so-called normalcy electoral processes and just don't want normally the power to be removed by force, that doesn't mean they're functional countries, but those countries will not want, they will generally not recognize the legitimacy of such usurping powers. Like, usually, when there's an usurping power, you don't have like the will to recognize it. Eventually, by realpolitik, with time going on, and if such new political authority is like responsible and just it took the political power by force, but it is actually respecting like international commitments. It is actually caring for the interests of the people. So you might say autocratic powers, but respecting the people. Eventually, there might be recognition of such authorities. But again, if there is like a group of political authority who jumps in by force and who just starts committing the most atrocious acts, the likelihood is that it will not be recognized. So you just cannot have a bunch of people who jump into the political power of a community and says, now you have a state, or they try to impose that narrative to other people. No, you need to be recognized as credible, as legitimate representative, and not just within your internal stakeholders, like the people within that country, but also outside for other people, generally speaking, for the other existing countries, because the other countries will need to recognize the existence of the so-called this new country coming. So for Palestine, it's not enough for the Palestinian people, let's say at the time in the beginning, in the very beginning of things, like decades ago, to just uh, put a bunch of people in power or have a faction within the so-called uh, community of Palestinian people who decides to just take the power by force and say, now we represent the state of Palestine and we want the recognition of the state of Palestine by other states. Like, other countries simply look at the so-called political representatives, they see that they took the power by force or that they're not complying with international obligations, and so they simply decide not to recognize. They say, okay, um, we agree that there should be like whatever a territory for the Palestinian people. There is a territory for that. We agree that there are people, the Palestinians there, but we do not agree on that state of Palestine because we don't agree with those guys as political authorities and political representatives. So again, all these things about the statehood of something, it's not just about the so-called formal criterias like the people, the territory, and the political authority. You also need the international recognition, and that in itself comes to the legitimacy of the political authority. Credibility, legitimacy, whatever. There's like the internal legitimacy or internal credibility. Okay, let's say that a group of uh, the so-called political authority is holds a de facto force within that country, either because it has been elected by the people of those countries, or because it has been agreed, or because it has been imposing itself by force. So it has a grip, or at least the people in the country agree that there is authority from such political groups. So they're like there'll probably be like political factions who have the upper hand, and they become the political authority and the representatives of such community. That's the internal legitimacy. They might be doing that process through free and fair elections, through rigged elections, because there's also rigged elections and forged elections, or by any other process, or even by force. But they're there, and the people agree, okay, there's this group of people, a faction or whatever that controls um, the political power, and which they agree that they are representatives of said community. So these are the political authorities. But that's the internal legitimacy. So there's an external one, exactly, the international recognition, because these political authorities, this prevalent faction or political groups, whatever that controls um, the political decisions within said community, they need to be recognized outside by the other states that already exist and by the representatives of such states. Because if the political authorities of the aspiring state, if such factions that control the power, the group of entities that control that political power, if they are not recognized as credible, as legitimate by a great number of other countries outside of existing countries and their representatives, then it's just not worthy. So there's also the issue of external legitimacy. So I'll give you an example for that. Let's say that there's a faction in Palestine, whatever, like let's put it. Um, there's the Fatah, like the political group, and within the West Bank, let's say, it is recognized as a representative of the Palestinians in said territory. And these so-called Fatah faction, they hold the political power there, they hold political representation. They've been elected by elections. Okay, they came through power. They came to power by elections. They were voted by the people. So there's like an internal legitimacy from the Palestinians in those territories, the internal legitimacy. And then there's the issue of external legitimacy. So what happens is that these people of Fatah, let's assume that they also have been elected in the Gaza Strip, whatever, they've been elected in the broader sense. So they're the legitimate, let's say, representatives because they have this internal legitimacy. Let's assume that they came from elections, but they could have come by force, whatever. They have the internal de facto control or power or representation. And what happens is that they also need to get the external validation. So when other countries are going to parley with Palestine, for example, France, if France is going to parley with Palestinians, the representatives of France, their diplomats, their political leaders, they're going to talk to the people they see as legitimate representatives or the aspiring representatives of the Palestinian would be state. So they go, for example, to that Fatah because they see, okay, Fatah has internal legitimacy, it has been elected, it represents the Palestinian people, like it wields authority over there. So we're going to talk to these guys as representatives of the Palestinian people. And that's how you can establish dialogue because you have a faction or a certain political group that has political authority that is either because of it has been internally elected or any other source or by force, but it is there and it wields political and de facto control over that territory. So that gives them internal legitimacy. And usually, if a faction, a political group has uh, this political authority, if it has the so-called political authority in a specific territory, then it is de facto like internally legitimate. And externally, because they see those factions as wielding political power there, they also see them as externally legitimate. assuming that there is no great violation of international obligations, like you don't have like stupid things or genocides or any of those things happening. Assuming that the powers that exist are like functional states who want the best for their states and they just respect the people there. Right. And this is exactly how we come to Palestine. But Palestine, you might say, right, yeah, I did talk about Fatah, right? But there are more organizations, there are more entities. And one question you might claim is there are more factions than just that Fatah in Palestine. So, how do you say which faction is legitimate and which is not? And how do you infer that Fatah is more legitimate than any other organization? Because then there are many other factions, political groups within the so called Palestinian community territories. You have Hamas, for example, right? The so called Hamas or whatever the purpose is. We're not discussing if the group is terrorist or not, if it has terrorist aims or not. We're just discussing that the existence of other political groups. And here comes the question. If there are several political groups, then how do you know which one is more legitimate than others? And this question makes sense if you're actually from an existing state. And when the issue comes of recognizing a new state, the aspiring Palestinian state, you need to carefully choose who are going to be your political interlocutors, who are going to be your representatives that you're talking on the other side of the table. Because the existing state has its own representatives, everything is already established, no problem. The problem comes that when you want to recognize or deal with the so called aspiring state of Palestine, with which entities you're going to talk. Because there's not just one, there are several political groups. You might say, okay, you talk to the one that has the most votes. But what if the ones that has been having the most votes is actually a terrorist organization and does not preclude the use of violence and even the extermination of other states? And what if there are other factions that even if they don't have the overwhelming majority of votes, they are actually moderate, they defend peaceful coexistence? I mean, that might sound a better track, right? Who are you going to place? It's like, who are you going to trust? Somebody that comes to you and says, okay, we're just trying to create a new state that coexists with other states in the region. We just want to be peaceful and just do our own things and grow and, establish ourselves in the community as just one more state and pursue peace and happiness. Or are you going to trust guys who say, we want to create a state that is recognized by the community so that we exterminate another state and destroy and wipe it out, and that will make us happy. You probably will not trust a lot these second guys unless obviously you're paying them or you're having some sort of vested interest in them. But otherwise, you would not trust the second guys, right? Just why are we handing power to these dudes who are just going to say that the first thing or one of the first things they're going to do is just to create mess and to just finish other states in the region? You probably will not like it. So you rather prefer the solution of the moderate guys. You prefer, okay, I would rather parlay with those people who are like more moderate or more sensible, and then they can give an impression that we can actually establish a common ground of peaceful coexistence with already existing states, lesser mess, and things will just be better off at some point in time. Because the problem with new states is that you don't want new states to come in a situation that creates further conflict. Because then, if you just want to force a state that is not going to be recognized, what's going to happen is that other existing countries are going to dispute the territory for that state, and that creates an even further mess. And this is exactly why the issue of state recognition is a tricky business. It cannot be handled lightly. It's not like, okay, I'm going to recognize this because it's a sunny day and I feel like it. Now, I don't say that when the states recognize that, they do it lightly. That's not the question. But when they do it, it's like a long-term decision. Good or bad, but at least it is a well-thought decision. And for the state of Palestine, it has been happening in such ways. Right. But now let's get to practical matters. The state of Palestine, you might say. So now you might it's like an entity that I can generally state at, by this time, I think the end of September is coming. And with that, the so-called General Assembly, where this issue of Palestine has been discussed, is also coming to an end. We can, I think we can now agree that the state of Palestine is largely recognized by a vast community of states around the world. You have doubts? Well, we can just look into that. So for that, let's see the states that actually have recognized Palestine. And here we have like a world map, right? Um, like this is in Wikipedia, and I would trust this particular source concerning this matter. You can see here the states, basically all the states here in the world with like their little borders in the map, and those that have recognized Palestine are in green, and it's all flushed in green. Everything. Yes, Antarctica is not a country. It's like a territory that is used internationally, and some countries have their own bases. But irrespective of Antarctica and even Greenland, because, well, no, Greenland is actually linked to Denmark, but irrespective of Antarctica, I would say 80%, 90% of the states here at least have recognized the existence of Palestine. Now, there's a trick to this. You might say, oh, this is so green, so probably this has been green for a very long time. Well, no. Actually, during a very long time, very little countries recognized Palestine. And I don't have here a track of specific dates. We don't have here like a timeline map of recognitions taking place. But I would say most of the states here that you see here that recognized Palestine are these recognitions came very recently, in less than 30 days ago, in this particular month. And that comes to our next topic, which is the General Assembly. So the General Assembly here, it's at the United Nations in that building in in New York City, in the United States, where basically each country has a seat. Each country has a way to voice its positions. So the United Nations, kind of like a state, has its different bodies. It has a legislative that basically passes the laws. It has an executive that enforces, like the government, and a sort of judicial. But that is the more complicated thing. What matters here is that in the so-called United Nations, there is a General Assembly, which is a bit like parliaments in states, or in the case of the United States, it would be like a Congress, basically where representatives of the state assemble and discuss state issues, kind of. And this General Assembly is important because on the course of many years of this United Nations, which has been founded since 1945, after um, with the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the New World Order at the time, which was led by the United States and European allies, and who else? The USSR, yes, so the Soviet Union. So basically, the winners of the Second World War. They kind of like established this new world order with the idea to promote peace and a peaceful resolution of conflicts and to allow the different countries and communities to prosper in harmony. Like the aim of everybody, right? The aim of every state. They just want to exist and coexist peacefully in theory. And eventually, if conflicts would arise, they would come here to the United Nations, they would voice their grievances, and somehow a solution would be found, a diplomatic solution. So this is exactly essentially um, a diplomatic entity under which states talk their own matters. Just like in parliaments, you have like in a state, you have parliaments where different political factions discuss uh, certain issues. That's how they work. And here, this General Assembly has been focusing on lots of different issues. But what matters is that for the international problems, every time there's like a huge issue, like in the international community, generally generally that's a pleonasm. Normally, all these subjects end up in the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, in practice, in the course of like more than 80 years, has become like a place where the countries or aspiring countries place their grievances, their state grievances. So if there's like an invasion of a country or for another, if there is a dispute over a territory, a border of resources, of this country is using the upstream river that we have downstream because, like, say for example, there are lots of issues that eventually end up in conflicts, like not in conflicts, and they end up in this General Assembly. Uh, and I use the simple fact of water because and for those that know, you have rivers, right? Obviously, you have rivers. So the question is, in those rivers, sometimes you might have dams that retain waters or not, depending on the flow of the river and other priorities. And for those that know how rivers work, when rivers in their beginning, the rivers in upstream, the rivers are like they're small, right? They don't have uh, a strong capacity of water. They don't have a great flow of water. But as you move on, generally the rivers become larger, and until they reach the seas, right? And then they're large. They're generally large. So there's the upstream and the downstream part. But what happens is that in what concerns rivers, if there is a retention of waters upstream, then anybody who is downstream is going to take less water because let's say that upstream there are several dams, so downstream you'll have less water. Now imagine that in the upstream areas you have a state, and in the downstream areas you have others. That gives rise to potential conflicts regarding the usages of water. So even that can lead to disputes between states. There's a plethora of different things that can lead to states having grievances against others, not just the physical confrontation, not just military or border issues, but sometimes trade issues. It could be um, this resource usages, anything, and even just sometimes political incidents like the representative of that country did not greet this representative of this country, so it's an offense for this country, and everything like spirals out of control. The so-called diplomatic incidents. There can be a lot of different things, and generally, every time there is like a contentious issue or an issue that is deemed worthy of contention, it it flows directly to the General Assembly. So anytime there's like trouble or an issue that demands like to be voiced publicly by other states, you'll generally see it in the General Assembly. So it's like a public market, right? A public forum. When there's a hot topic, a hot issue, it goes there internationally. And that's exactly where Palestine has been heading. since the very, very beginning. And this question of Palestine, it's not something that came today or in the month of September 2025. No, this came a long time ago. You have here. This is like this particular link I decided to just explore because it gives you like um, some quick information regarding that. And you see here that the question of Palestine was brought in General Assembly by 1947. So just 2 years after the creation of the UN, basically. It's a very long issue. This like it's more than 70 years, 80 years practically, right? So with this said, um, you can see that this issue of Palestine has been around the corner for a very long time, even before either like any of us were born, I think. Well, not any of us, but a lot of us. So you can see here that, okay, they're talking about resolutions. Like any assembly, you just have like some documents under which you you voice your position. So collectively, because the General Assembly, again, it's not something that works per se. It has representatives of states, so people, right? Representatives of states, generally one person for each state, normally, I think. And these people, they represent either the will of the political interpretation of that state. They're there so that the state has a means to represent itself in the face of the General Assembly. So you might say, who? Well, political representatives of that country, accredited diplomats, or even the political leaders of that country when that is the case. As you probably did see that in this month of September. And what happens is that in this General Assembly, every time they want to make like a proposal, they want to decide on some issue, like they want to make a statement, a collective statement, then they make a proposal, and if it is passed, it becomes an adopted resolution. And the resolution is essentially the document under which the assembly passes its will. So let's assume that this assembly just wants to discuss on the state of Palestine. So they gather, they set up a meeting for that with all the representatives of different states, and each of them decides to either recognize yes or no for the state of Palestine. And in case there's a majority of votes, then the resolution is passed. And that means that the General Assembly recognizes that state of Palestine. And this happens, I think, with any other issue. Like a resolution, there's a proposal. It cannot be any proposal. It needs to be a valid legal proposal, respecting international laws and other things. But there is a proposal that is made. Other states, like they take their decision. Um, they express how they want regarding that issue, if they agree, if they disagree, or if they just abstain from a certain positioning. And once you establish the collective will through a majority, if there is a majority for that proposal, then the resolution is adopted. Otherwise, it's not adopted. In the case where the resolution is adopted, then it becomes becomes law, like it becomes a law kind of thing, and the General Assembly like establishes like a law. So it's like this General Assembly, for example, if there's a proposal regarding the recognition of the state of Palestine, the proposal is discussed, the states vote, and if there's a majority, then the proposal is adopted, you have a resolution. And this resolution becomes law. It means that the General Assembly recognizes the state of Palestine. Then there is obviously other issues, which is the enforceability of the resolutions. But we're not talking about that part because it's an entire new rabbit hole if we're going to talk about the other important body of the United Nations, the other important entity, which is the Security Council. and that's an entirely different matter that we can postpone that for another discussion. So I'm not going to mix those topics. Here, just to keep it simple, and already this is becoming a little bit more complicated, regarding the state of Palestine, uh, so what happens is that in 1947, there was this resolution. And I just explained to you how these kinds of documents are passed. So there's like a meeting there that is established, adjourned to discuss a specific issue. In this case, it was the question of Palestine. And then the states have to discuss the issue. Eventually, there's a proposal to vote something. And if there's a majority, then eventually it becomes adopted. So it is exactly kind of what happened in 1947. So there was this resolution, 181, and the General Assembly, they say here, they decided to partition Palestine into two states. Now, we are here watching the roots of all this conundrum about Palestine. I know that we're on 2025, but sometimes we just have to dig in the history box in the time machine to understand what has been taking place. And there was this resolution under which this General Assembly they decided to separate Palestine into two states. They say here one Arab and one Jewish states, with Jerusalem placed under a special international regime. So Jerusalem is like that main capital, and it would be like a special capital where like a part of Jerusalem would be for the Arab state and the other part would be the Jewish state. And I think like the Arab part would be like East Jerusalem, and the Jewish would be the other part, kind of. They say here after the 1948 war, so again, there was a war regarding that, regarding the state of Palestine and in Israel. I think it's in the foundation of Israel, because the question of Palestine is like intrinsically linked to the state of Israel. And what happens is that after the Second World War, once the Second World War ended, not just UN was created, but there was a will. You can see that there was also the so-called Balfour Declaration. I can see that here. Balfour Declaration. A long time, like even before um, the end of the Second World War, there was this idea that uh, the Jewish people in the diaspora would have to have their own state. And that comes right since like 1917, this first like political statement declaration. It comes from like this British secretary, foreign secretary, and since 1970, so even earlier, that the Jewish people would have to somehow have their own state. And that creates also for the so-called the Zionism issues. Like we're not going to discuss this particular issue now. Just saying that this Zionism is essentially the idea that the new state that would be created, which would be like the state of Israel, would be a Jewish state. So it's like a state where there is religion, where there is like Judaism. It's not just any other state, a state with Jewish people. It's a state with like this Jewish religion, like overseeing the state. It's a bit like theocracy, I kind of think. But we're not going to look into that. This we can look it into any other session. So as I was saying, back to the General Assembly, this here, what happens is that when Israel was established, exactly after the Second World War, because, you know, considering the horrors that took place in the Second World War, particularly the genocide of Jews that were exterminated and killed, brutally killed in those execution chambers in Nazi Germany. in the so-called concentration camps and even extermination camps, or just routinely. First, during the Nazi uh, Germany period, in the entire period of the Nazi Germany political power, since the 1930s, because there were several incidents against the Jews and even several killings and murders of Jews, and even attacks on the synagogues and Jewish properties, Crystal Nights and all those things, even before the Second World War, from those big atrocities that I think most of us are fully aware that took place in the Second World War regarding uh, the deportation, the segregation of Jews. Um, they're used for concentration camps and even for hard labor, and the famine of Jewish people and extermination of even Jewish people en masse. Since particularly since the 1940s until 1945, when there was the so-called final solution established by the Nazi authorities in Nazi Germany. And among that, what happens is that at least 6 million Jews were killed during that period. And it just like created a huge wall of shame under which the international community felt the pressure to finally act on the Jewish issue and allow, you know, it's not a compensation, but to understand the horrors that were perpetrated against the Jewish people, that they were unacceptable and that they're shameful. And so the Jewish people need to have like a home, a safety place. That would be the idea. They would have to have their own state. They would need to have a state at least, so that they would not disappear. They would have their culture, and otherwise it would just be a statement of hypocrisy by the international community to just say, okay, 6 million Jews were exterminated and we didn't give a crap. That could not be. So there was like this collective shame and guilt by the international community as a result of what has been allowed, what was allowed to take place regarding Jews, not just during the 1940 to 1945, but even before all that successive degradation with the aim to uh, humiliate, degrade, uh, progressively kill, and even silently kill the Jewish people. Like there was this idea that the international community stood idle where it should have acted, and there was this collective guilt. Upon that, the international community had this need to say, okay, we need to establish a home, a safe haven for the Israeli people. So there was the state of Israel that was created after the Second World War. So when was the creation of the state of Israel exactly? Creation of Israel. Exactly. So it was 1948. And once there was this creation of Israel, you understand what happened. Some states did not want to recognize that and they went to war. It is this war that this General Assembly is speaking. So there was the 1948 war, the war between the new state of Israel that was established and essentially neighboring Arab countries, because they did not want to recognize Israel, like it was like seen as a hostile body, like a little virus, speaking in medical terms, that was establishing in the region. And the already existing states in the region, they just wanted to have that territory. They didn't want that territory to just be taken away from them. Or worse, they decided to land grab that territory and said, hey, actually, the state of Israel is new, so we might just take our chance and do a land grab because we're established, we have armies. Israel is just fairly new. And that was the idea behind this aggression of the other states against Israel, because it was a new guy, like the new state, it still was not established. They thought that they could have their way. And that established this war. Now, as you can see here, let's see this war. Now, probably there was this war. I'm just trying to see. Okay, Arab-Israeli War of 1948. That's it. So this war, it broke out. It's in this archives of I think this is Israel, when five Arab nations invaded territory in the former Palestinian Mandate, immediately following the announcement of the independence of the State of Israel. So you see here, the very first moment that Israel lay the establishment, lay its own existence, the moment Israel proclaimed that we exist to the international community, from that moment things started to become a little bit more tricky. So obviously you have here the state of Israel, right? The borders. I would like to expand and to see less of political figures because that's not our aim. So you see here the borders of the state of Israel. And like here, it's like the state which technically belongs to the Palestinian part. Because when there was the partition of the former existing state in the region, which was, um, it still was not a state because it was under colonial administration. It was the Palestinian territory. It was called a Palestinian territory and it was under British administration. The solution for that territory was to partition, to divide that territory into two different states without any British colonial administration. One would be in the rule of the Arabs, and the other would be in the rule of the Jews. The one who would be in the rule of the Arabs, like Palestine, the one who would be in the rule of the Jews would be Israel. And that was the two state solution, at least how it was devised, kind of like in the very beginnings. This in 1947, right? That's that's the aim. But the problem was that as soon as Israel established itself in 1948, boom, five Arab countries instantly decided to attack Israel. Because they did not accept that, there's a new state in the region that suddenly comes out of the blue, and they just didn't want that. They wanted to have territorial control over the place. Or they actually tried to get any land grabs. So you can see at the time, because obviously these are not the borders of the time, Israel actually like territory of would be Israel was lesser. There was Egypt, there was Iraq, Syria, Jordan. There were all of these countries. And as soon as Israel tried to establish itself, basically the neighboring countries, either by greed or by territorial motivations, they tried to take their land grabs of the new state because they thought they make a value assessment judgment where they see, okay, Israel is like a new state. It's probably very fresh, very rookie, very new. They won't have a lot of experience dealing with military policement, military control of territories. Their army is like very weak because they've just decided to create themselves a state. They have no experience and they'll be like easy prey against land grabs. But that was the idea. So those neighboring Arab countries, obviously because they also had enmity regarding this existence of a Jewish state, but also because of de facto reasons, because Israel was new and these Arab states were already established a long time ago. They had armies. They were attempting to get land grabs. Let's not for, let's also not forget that this region, it's the Middle East. It's actually the closed Middle East. Like but the Middle East is characterized essentially by limited land, limited arable land that can be used for agriculture, or and a great span of deserts and areas that basically cannot be used for agricultural purposes. Like essentially, the main hub activities are located near the sea areas, near the coastlines, and then there are a few like rivers along the place where you have settlements and towns, and they're important hubs. And then outside of that, it's desert It's arid lands. It's There's not much for that. So since the land, and especially the agricultural land and the land with water, is scarce, there will be a huge competition. The different states will try to compete over the use of that land. They just want to get as more as possible. And seeing that Israel, establishing at the time, was the new state, the new guy in the block, well, the other guys had just territorial aims and they tried to get as much as they could. Ideally, they thought that they would get their grabs over Israel. But this backfired because after this war, basically Israel won that war. And although they were obviously surprised by this invasion of five Arab states. Let's see if we see here. So here, on the eve of May the 14th, Arabs launched an air attack. The Israelis resisted. Then this action was followed by the invasion by Arab armies from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Saudi Arabia sent a formation that fought under the Egyptian command. So one, two, three, four, basically five Arab states tried to get their land grabs. The British trained forces intervened in the conflict, but only in the areas that were designated as part of the Arab state under the United Nations Partition Plan and the Corps Separatum of Jerusalem. After tense early fighting, Israeli forces now under joint command were able to gain the offensive. So essentially, despite being caught off guard by this invasion by five Arab countries, and with basically a little protection from the British forces at the time, which were the previous colonizing power in the region, then they left. Israel was able to prevail on this particular war. And as a result, they gained more territories, I think. Um, Fighting continued. Then there was a ceasefire during the conflict. Fighting continued until 1949. Uh, Israel and Arab states did not reach agreements until February. And here, Israel gained some territory firmly granted to Palestinian Arabs under the United Nations resolution in 1947. Now, this is important because the so-called original plan to make the Palestinian state here in this General Assembly of 1947, where there were specific territories for Israel, specific territories for the Arab state, those territories were changed as a result of this war. And now they say Egypt and Jordan retain control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank separately. And basically, these were the new territories, the new lines until 1967. Whatever. This is just to say that it is from the moment the state of Israel was created that this contentious issue arose. And then as soon as the state of Israel was created in 1948, there was a war between Israel and the Arab countries. In that war, Israel was able to defend itself and it actually gained the upper hand, so it gained even more territories. And after this war, there was a new resolution. This resolution established the conciliation for Commission of Palestine to help the parties reach a final settlement, referring the rights of the Palestinian refugees to return and restitution. And there's also a new agency for Palestinian refugees. Right, basically it's a help for the displaced people, the displaced Palestinians, because they were facing the conflict at a time, and to make sure that they would get some assistance provided for them. But you can also see that the original, the most important thing to retain is that the original borders between the two states, as per 1947 Resolution 181, these things were changed by 1948. Because once Israel defended itself against that Arab aggression, the Arab-Israel war, they gained territories that in 1947 were to be given the so-called Arab state. So that already changed things. And this is exactly to tell you that although there's a very long history of the so-called state of Palestine to be created, this Arab part of the so-called of the previous existing Palestinian uh, administrative region, because before 1945 it was like an autonomous territory governed by the British authorities. And once the Second World War ended, it was decided to partition that state into two ones, into that partition that territory into two separate ones. The Arab one, which the idea of Palestine, and the Jewish one. And these borders already were changed by successive developments. They were not the same. So you might think this is no longer a static question. It's not. We're in 2025 and we are revisiting this resolution 181 and seeing what territories should belong to Palestine and what should belong to Israel. It's not that how it happened. There was a dynamics, and there were not just one war. There were several wars uh, during this period until basically 2020. There were so many wars. I'm not going to look at each of these specific wars, but basically, each time there was a war, mostly, each time Israel started to gain more territories that originally were to be handed to the Arab state. Now, of course, there were like provocations. Israel was invaded in two or three different times at least. I don't know. They were like they were subject to invasions, wars, and obviously Israel defended themselves. And the result of each of these smaller conflicts, because they never lasted too long, there was even, for example, the War of 7 Days or the Yom Kippur War, I think, probably the most famous. There was another surprise attack by the Arab coalition, and this one was in the 1970s. This war lasted 2 weeks and 5 days. What matters is that after these conflicts between Arab countries and Israel in the region, the thing is that Israel always gained the upper hand and always grabbed more territories from either their Arab neighbors and also from the so-called Arab states that should be destined for the Palestinians. So you have like the problem of the so-called shrinking of the Palestinian state. And let's see here if we can have that. Shrinking of Palestine. Like ideally, we could just have a dynamic map where we could see these original borders of 1947 being progressively diminished. And the idea is always the same, that the land for the so-called Arab state becomes progressively smaller. Let's see here, select tier. I think this works. Right. So this was like the previous Palestine, but here. It says under Ottoman rule, uh, it was like the different periods until World War One. But what matters is that after the Second World War, you have this idea to establish a Palestinian state and an Israel state. So in black, you see the areas that would become like essentially Jewish populations or for the establishment of Israel. And in blue, in light teal, you see like the areas that would remain in Palestine. And here you see what's happening. 1960. Following the forced displacement, Nakba, over 750,000 Palestinians. In 1948, the new state of Israel enacts laws to confiscate the vast majority of Palestinian lands. And this is where things became even worse because I told you about this war in 1948. So there was a forced displacement. And we can look as what was first, the Arab Israeli War of 1948 or the actual forced displacement of the Palestinians. Let's check that because we need to analyze the causes for that. Forced displacement. When does this take place? At least the first one. Uh, where to 48? Right. Let's get to the origins of these forced displacements. So this term Nakba is used like to establish like a huge tragedy when an entire community is forcefully displaced from their would-be lands into nowhere land and to either just die or perish or lose their sense of identity of community identity. It's like a tragic word, and it's the literal translation for that. It's catastrophe. It's a violent displacement, but it's meant to suppress a culture. It's like genocide, but without the killing. It's like forcing these people out of their land so that they lose their sense of identity and eventually, uh, you know, their collective sense just disappears from memory. And what we're seeing here is that this Nakba started like it was intensifying since 1948. They say that during the 1948 Palestinian War, it's exactly when the Nakba took place. About 750,000 Palestinians, over 80% of the population living in the territory of what became the State of Israel, were expelled or fled from their homes and became refugees. 11 Arab towns and cities and over 500 villages were destroyed or depopulated. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in dozens of massacres. So there was also ethnic cleansing, so war crimes. About a dozen rapes of Palestinians, again, war crimes by regular and Israeli military forces have been documented. Israelis use psychological warfare tactics to frighten Palestinians into fight, including targeted violence, whispering campaigns, radio broadcasts, and loudspeaker events. Propaganda, basically. Looting by Israeli soldiers and civilians of Palestinian homes, businesses, farms, art books, and archives was widespread. The destruction of culture, property, of arts, any sorts of damage. Mm-hmm. And when this war began? In May 1948. Hmm, exactly. So even before the Israeli state established itself on May 19, 1948, in the months prior to that, there was already a campaign of forceful displacements of populations of huge quantities of Palestinians over the territory that still was not Israel to be expelled out of that territory. 2 months before, they say here, from November 1947 to May 1948. This is the genesis even before the creation of the State of Israel. And how these new authorities, these would-be new authorities in Israel, were trying to address the issue of territory. So the first thing they did before the creation of the State of Israel, they planned to just expel by force as many Palestinians as they could, which is basically ethnical cleansing, genocide, right? So what kind of state you establish, where in order for you to establish, you're getting rid of people who already live there, because I mean, it doesn't make any sense that you allow the creation of a state where the purpose of the state is to expel and get rid of anybody who exists there before, right? If the state is harmonious, it should just accept the people that are there and just try to make its own life and build from there. No, Israel here as a state, it wanted to establish itself by expelling the communities of people, the thousands of people, these Palestinians who lived already in those territories. So they wanted to depopulate those territories so that their settlers could come in and land grab those territories. Now, this would just be completely acceptable if there were nobody in those people, if there were settlers coming in a new land, like a newfound land. But there were already thousands of people living there, and these people were forcefully displaced, which obviously not is not acceptable. But it was not just a forceful displacement. These people were threatened, were brutalized, raped, their property destroyed, their cultural heritage destroyed as well, because they wanted to intimidate and expel these people out. They were like subject to any sort of psychological pressure. They wanted to get those Palestinian peoples out of those lands because they wanted to place those settlers there. And the easiest way, immoral way, would just be to just get rid of the existing people there. Get rid, like in the way that you have to go, because this is now the land for our settlers. That's the genesis of this Palestinian issue. And what we're seeing here is that even before the creation of the state of Israel, the would-be authorities, or they decided to just exercise bullying and repression over the peoples and communities that already existed in those territories and expel them out and use deadly force, intimidation, brutal techniques, basically doing what the Nazis did. Amazing, right? So there was a Second World War, and the new would be existing state was employing the same forceful means as the Nazis were using in Germany and in the rest of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. Amazing. Nevertheless, let's see exactly what happened in this Genesis before May 1948, in the months that preceded that. Small-scale local skirmishes began on 30th of November and gradually escalated until March 1948. When the violence started, Palestinians had already begun fleeing, expecting to return after the war. The massacre and expulsion of Palestinian Arabs and destruction of villages began in December, including massacres Al-Qissas, 18 December 1947, Balad al-Sheikh, 31 December. By March, between 70,000 and 100,000 people, mostly middle and upper class urban elites, were expelled or fled. So there was this systematic persecution of Palestinian people. Again, ethnic cleansing, genocide, intimidation, violence tactics, brutal warfare, even rape. So, and massacres, war crimes, war crimes against Palestinian people, simply because they were not born with the right religion or the right ethnicity. Just because. Amazing, right? This happened. And this is a contentious issue because you already can see that although there obviously are political, there are de facto motivations by Arab countries too. When they started that Arab-Israel war in exactly where uh, this war, where did it start? It even if in May 14, 15, these Arab states declared their war against Israel, the seeds for the dissent, the hatred, the violence, and the persecution, and the non peaceful coexistence with the existing Palestinian people, they already were planted long before that. And that's where the problem rises. Because you just cannot create a state if Your aim was to annihilate, diminish, or suppress a culture, suppress the groups of people who live there. It's just not feasible. You will not be recognized as legitimate representative. You may use force, you may use intimidation techniques, but you will spark public outcry, rage, and opposition. So if you see this genesis of who was there first, the egg or the chicken, I'm inclined to see that this provocation all started by this need for the to be established Israel authorities to expel forcefully the Palestinians from their lands using any means, employing any brutal tactics, similar and likewise to the tactics that were used by the Nazis, even resorting to rape, violence, and even massacres to get these people forcefully out uh, of their lands simply because they did not have the right ethnicity or religion. Shameful. But that's why we're discussing this here. So don't try to make this idea like Palestinians are bad and Israelis are good, and it's the Palestinians that are terrorists and the Israelis are the victims. Let's try to frame things from the start. This is like the root, the history of what took place. Like I know some people say history is written by the winners. No, history is not written by arrogant psychopaths. People are able to discuss it. You don't have somebody imposing history to another person. You can think about that. So it's not force that dictates history. It's not enough for you to, if you want to conquer a country by force, if you cannot gain the support of the people, you will lose it. So force, brute force, that doesn't achieve anything. The same happens with history. It's not because you want to impose something that it becomes so it doesn't. People understand that and they make their own conclusions regarding that. So trying to demonize the Palestinians is the quickest way for you to lose credibility. If you are like thinking that the Palestinians are the bad people, they're not. They're people just like you and me who lived in those lands. We're talking about those who were forcefully displaced. And I'm thinking I'm coming like to a big time machine because long before there were people who lived there and they were forcefully displaced, pushed back and ousted of their homes simply because they did not have the right ethnicity and or the right religion. And it happened by the so-called new authorities of Israel. They were the ones behind this. So to not address the Nakba and to just talk about the Israeli Palestinian issue without addressing that there was this forceful displacement and the killings of Palestinian people, that's an act of extreme abject hypocrisy. It has to be addressed. So here, um, you see here that there were other conflicts, uh, and basically they were also constantly every time there was a contentious issue in the region, it was a pretext for the authorities of Israel to progressively shrink the land for the Palestinians, to do consecutively more land grabs. So let's see here, for example, from the beginning. Now, after the creation, like of April, like a little bit before the creation of Israel, in early April 1948, the Israelis launched Plan Dalet. Well, that's a plan, a large-scale offensive to capture land and empty it of Palestinian Arabs. Just look at this. They did not hide this. The purpose of the state of Israel was to actually depopulate the territories of Palestinian people. It was to deprive them of their land. And this comes from a state who is fighting the so-called Hamas. Remember the Hamas, right? The political faction of Palestine that is using violence and resorting to terrorism, that has not denied the use of terrorism, and who has even used the violence like capturing hostages to make their political demands, like other terrorist groups. They, this group Hamas, it defends the wiping out of the state of Israel. So basically, the state of Israel, the territory of Israel, to disappear. They don't defend the extermination of the people in Israel. No, no, no. That's an entirely that's bullshit. That's an entirely. They defend the wiping out of the state of Israel. Of course, you might say that that is repulsive for an entity to defend the extermination of a state, the extermination, not the extinguishing of a state territory. But what is exactly Israel being doing to the people who are living in those territories since 1948? Emptying it of the previous residing and established Palestinian Arabs there, which is exactly kind of like the counter of what Hamas was doing, of what Hamas is doing. Now you might say, well, it seems like Hamas is like the reaction to the Israel action of depopulating, because since Israel wanted to depopulate, wanted to forcefully remove the Palestinians from their land, then Hamas comes and they say, we want to forcefully remove the existence of a state of Israel, tit for tat. That's exactly how it builds up. Anyway, back to this. They say that during this offensive of Plan Dalet, Israel captured and cleared land that UN partition resolution had allocated to Palestinians. Okay, so you see already here, each time that Israel does some sort of offensive or reacts to some sort of pressure or provocation by Arab countries, the purpose was always the same: to increase the land grab in the region and to push the Palestinians away from their territory. So the division of the so-called initial territory into two states, an Arab and the Jewish, the idea was to progressively shrink the Palestinian state, the Arab state, and to progressively expand the Jewish state. And you might understand what is the real aim. So the aim would be, if like this sort of action would be left unchecked in time, then eventually at some point in time, he would have Israel controlling the entirety of the previous Palestinian administered British territory. The idea was to separate uh, that that previous British administered territory into two states, an Arab one and a Jewish one. And eventually, the aim of this Israeli state is to overthrow, to absorb the territories that would be given to the so-called Arab state, so that the territories of the Jewish state and the Arab state would just be into a single state, which would be the Israeli state, governed by the Jewish state. And that's exactly what has been happening with each time, with each passing years, each successive action of Israel. It has the consequence of expanding this land grab, expanding the state, the territorial control of Israel, and shrinking and diminishing the so-called Arab Palestinian state, and even the territories where the Palestinian people are displaced. Because there is even something more troubling thing, which is the settlements and the forced settlements that Israel has been doing more recently, especially since 2000. But the idea was to just force settlements of Jewish people in the so-called Palestinian territories to legitimize the occupation of those territories and the expansion of the so-called Israeli state and the shrinking of the Arab Palestinian states. It's always the benefit of one at the expense of the diminishing of the other. But here, obviously, it's even worse. We're not just talking about the land grab from a state regarding the other one. It's the entire annihilation and suppression, I would say complete suppression, of the Palestinian people in this process were forcefully taken out of their homes, their communities, and the places where they were making their lives and just established for centuries or decades, whatever. These people, from one day to another, were forcefully ousted with nowhere to go, nothing. And they were forcefully ousted without their belongings. They were like forced, like like the how you call it, the beggars. People were forced out of their houses, of their cities, of their communities, without anything except perhaps their clothes they were carrying and one or two personal belongings. That's it. They were worse. They were left worse than beggars. This was the Nakba, the suppression and destruction of the collective identity of the Palestinian people through forceful displacements. So here we can see that this plan d'alerte was uh, another excuse for a land grab and a petty excuse for war crimes, whatever. 200 villagers were destroyed during this period. Massacres and expulsions continued, including here in Deir Yassin, 9 April 1948. Major Palestinian cities were depopulated. Depopulation. See, this is not a simple act of, oh, we're going to establish ourselves there in territories that have no population. Those territories were already previously populated by established, uh, like by Palestinian families and Palestinian people centuries ago. And from one day to the other, they were completely ousted by force. They were brutalized and they were forcefully expelled and kicked out of their homes. So now suddenly those homes and those communities become empty. No, they were not empty. They were communities with people, and these people were thrown out. These are not lands where there were no people. This is not newfound land. I mean, it's like it doesn't matter what we do to the people that were established there. It doesn't matter that we starve them, we deport them, we forcefully displace them so that they collectively disappear. They just wanted to have that place for themselves. What kind of narcissism, psychopathy is that? They say here major Palestinian cities were depopulated, including Tiberias, Haifa, Acre, Safed, Jaffa, and West Jerusalem's Palestinian Arab neighborhood. Israel began engaging in biological warfare in April and poisoned the water supplies of certain towns and villages. In May, one such operation caused a typhoid epidemic in Acre. The Egyptians foiled another attempt in Gaza. Under intense public anger over Palestinian losses and seeking to take Palestinian territory for themselves to counter the Israeli Jordanian deal, the remaining Arab League states decided in late April and early May to enter the war after the British left. But the newly independent Arab League states' armies were still weak and unprepared for war. None of the Arab states were interested in establishing independent Palestinian states. Okay, there was some political developments at the time. Nobody was willing to like defend this Palestinian state. Um, they were completely, and the Arab League states' army that was still not prepared for war. And on 14 May, the mandate formally ended. The last British troops left, and Israel declared independence. By that time, Palestinian society was destroyed, and over 300,000 Palestinians had been expelled or fled. Wow, what convenience! What a convenience that you establish a state exactly a few months after forcefully expelling, and by forcefully expelling, resorting even to violence, killings, and massacres, and even rapes of Palestinian peoples, of 300,000 Palestinian people. I mean, of course, then you can create a state because those lands are empty. And if those lands are empty, of course, we're going to place the settlers there because those lands are empty. But those lands were not empty. You emptied them. So this is another war crime: forceful displacement of populations, rapings, killings, massacres, ethnic cleansing. Ridiculous. A state was created having on the genesis the expulsion, the persecution, and the collective punishment of people who were established there simply because they did not have the right ethnicity and they did not have the right religion or did not have the right religion. Because apparently, if you were not Jew or Israeli, you did not have that. But those 300,000 Palestinians, unfortunately, were not able to express their views on the issue. They were just forcefully thrown and lots of people killed, thousands, right? And probably those deads cannot speak. Convenient, right? That the deads cannot speak. And it is on that on that bloodstain that the Israeli state was founded. This was the Nakba. This was the real tragedy. Uh, the erosion, the collective, progressive, subtle, the subtle suppression of Palestinian people, a silent, long term, and sound suppression. And this started since the 1948, even before um, the so-called war of April of the so-called Arab-Israeli war after exactly after the foundation of Israel, because the root of the problem stemmed from the would-be authorities of Israel in the months before that. Had those to be created Israel authorities not decided to expel the Palestinian people, which obviously they did not, and not decide to use of abusive tactics, forceful displacement populations, intimidation, uh, persecution, and other of those abject means to forcefully remove the Palestinians from their lands, then maybe we would have a two-state solution established. But no, they just wanted to uh, get rid of the Palestinian people, collectively punish them, and seek the suppression and the destruction of their cultural and their identity, their culture and identity, the Nakba. So you cannot talk about the story of Palestine and Israel without referring to this subject. Refusing to address this thing that took place, this horrible and abject thing, forceful displacement of population, the killings, the massacre, the brutality, the persecution of Palestinian people who were forcefully thrown out of their home in a systemic and deliberate ethnic cleansing and genocide. That's an act of extreme hypocrisy and connivance. And connivance. Now, of course, there were more of these forceful displacements. This was in 1948. But each time you understand that there was a continuous purpose of Israel to systematically push Palestinians and establish Palestinians out of any land they took. Because the aim was to depopulate the territories with Palestinian people completely or as most as possible and tend to repopulate those territories with Jewish populations that would be favorable to the state of Israel. And they would just resort to any means available. So you have here, like what? Another massacre. May 1948, October 1948. And this was long before. This was long before the October the 7th terrorist attack by Hamas. Because obviously you have that. See here. October the 7th. So long before this attack of October the 7th of 2023, long before that, where there was the kidnapping of Israeli people and the killings of civilians, even children, the kidnappings of women, children, elderly, anything. The thing is, long before that, Israel was committing atrocities against the Palestinian people. So if you're blaming Hamas and the radical Palestinian factions for the problems within the Middle East, because you refuse to address the very problems, the very sins that Israel has been committing on the region for years, that is a problem. So, how do we address this? How do we address this? One thing we can see is look at history. Because if we look at history, we might understand how exactly Israel has been behaving and what kind of things Israel has been accomplishing in the region, what kind of acts. We already see that they made forceful displacements and killings to get people forcibly removed out of their lands, the Palestinians out of their lands. But this has a long history, and this track continues until present. So you see here, May 1948, October 1948. On May the 15th, Arab League armies entered the territory of the former Military Palestine. Second half of 1948 Palestine War. Most of the violence that had occurred in and around urban centers in the Israeli portion of the partition land, while British troops were still present after the mandate, Israel seized more land allocated to the Palestinians by the UN partition plan, and expulsions, massacres, and destructions of villages and rural areas increased. The Tantura massacre was committed on the 22nd to the 23rd of May. Well, it was a small village of 1,500 people, you can see here, and they were massacred by the Israel's Haganah. The massacre occurred after the surrender of the village of Tantura, a small village of roughly 1,500 people located near Haifa. The number of those kills unknown, which with estimates ranging from dozens to more than 200. Again, the systematic cleansing and uh, genocide of Palestinian people, the systematic cleansing, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of Palestinian people. And then, of course, there were truces, but another thing here. Then you see here, okay, a final truce between Israel and the Arab League nations was signed in early June and lasted about a month. Well, just a month. In the summer of 1948, Israel began implementing anti-repatriation policies to prevent the return of Palestinians to their homes. So you can see here, not content with having forcefully expelled the Palestinians from their territories, they wanted to make sure that they could not even return or dare to return to their homes. So it's just a genocide, ethnical cleansing with an extra security layer. Amazing. A transfer committee coordinated and supervised efforts to prevent Palestinian return, including the destruction of villages, resettlement of Arab villages with Jewish immigrants. So you can see here the settlements, the need to expel the Palestinian peoples of their lands to replace those people with Jewish settlements and Jewish settlers, confiscation of land, which is aligned with the Nakba principle of forcefully expelling the Palestinians from their lands because the lands is the substract from those people and the means through which those people took the subsistence, not just especially in rural areas, right? Because people live from the land and the agricultural works, and even from the cities, because if you oust them out of their properties, how are they going to make their lives? They can't. And dissemination of propaganda discouraging return. During the 10 days of renewed fighting between Israel and the Arab states of the first truce, over 15,000 Palestinians were expelled. Okay, so more Palestinians. First it was 300,000, now 15,000. That makes more than 350,000. Wow. A second truce was signed mid-July and lasted until October. During the two truces, Palestinians who returned to their homes or crops, called infiltrators by the Israelis, were killed or expelled. Really. And this is the benevolence of the state of Israel created. So the moment it was created, it waged a genocidal war against the Palestinian people. And you think about the two-state solution as the solution for this problem. How can you establish that the two-state solution is the solution for this problem, where one state systematically is advocating openly or tacitly for the destruction, extermination of the other peoples? That's exactly what they've been doing. Because if you're depopulating another state of their people, if you're carrying out ethnic cleansing, if you're carrying out forcefully displacement of populations of a certain group and ethnicity, the Palestinians here, that's because you want the extermination of that group. That's because you want the suppression. You want the ethnic cleansing. You're actually carrying out genocide against that group. This is not even 2025. This is like the history before of the so-called state of Israel. So look at the facts, because the dead people, they speak through history as well. Then you have here, obviously more, October 1948, 1949, so 1 year later, expulsions, massacres, and Israel expansion continued in the autumn of 1948. Let's remind that as we are addressing this, there's so many voices that were suppressed and silenced and censored so that this issue could not even be reached. I'm not talking about now, present today, because of course we can read this, but how much of this was covered up, was buried with three layers, because two were not enough to make sure that this was not sufficiently told. And it's issues like this, these outrageous issues of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and entire cleansing of a collective groups of people, the Palestinians, that gives rise to this international condemnation. This is what gives public outroar. And this is exactly why the Palestinian issue has become more and more strong and more marked with successive years in the UN General Assembly because of the persecution, the systematic persecution, cleansing, ethnic cleansing, and with the aim of suppressing the Palestinians. And that's because why this issue has been growing more. Naturally, you have some people in the spectrum that are becoming more strong, and they are becoming even more passionate about this issue of Palestine, because they don't like, I think, like any sane human being, they don't like to see uh, genocides, ethnic cleansing, and daily collective persecution taking place. And this is like a very long history taking place. So you have here Israeli expansion continued in the autumn of 1948. This period saw the depopulation of Beersheba, 21st of October, the Al Dwayama massacre, another massacre, and the Safsaf massacre. So it is a pattern of depopulation, forcefully expulsion of Palestinians from their lands, with deportations, uh, perhaps even torture, killings, massacres, anything. The aim was also the aim is justified by the means, by this kind of Israeli position at the time. So, like they're legitimizing the killings, the brutal genocide and systematic persecution of Palestinians. Unthinkable. In October, Israel converted the ad hoc military governance ruling Palestinian Arabs in Israel into a formal military government. The new system controlled nearly all aspects of their lives, including curfews, travel restrictions, employment, and other economic restrictions. arbitrary detentions and other punishments, and political control. Basically, Palestinians here became like worse than POWs. They became fifth class citizens, not even third class citizens, with restrictions in every single aspect of their daily life, of their civil life, of their private life. Everything is under control. Basically, it's their way to say you only exist as long as we want, and you can only exist as much as we want. So it was fear, intimidation, and brutality, and the need to instigate psychological terror over the Palestinians, which is also another form of repression, torture, and genocide, because it is meant to suppress the collective identity of the Palestinians. Martial law assisted Israeli efforts to find, expel, or kill infiltrators in order to prevent Palestinians from repopulating their villages. Exactly, to expel the Palestinians from their villages, because their villages are no longer their villages. They have been forcibly kicked out of their villages. They've been threatened, killed, cancelled, and now those villages are to be repopulated by the so-called clean, pure settlers, who are the right people with the right ethnics, the right religion, the right things, everything. And the people were wrong. They were there where they had the wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity, so they could not be there, right? There's the right people and the wrong people, similar like to the Nazis. Talking about Aryanism, and most of the fighting between Israel and the Arab states ended by the winter. December 1948, UN passed Resolution 194, which declared, now this is interesting, considering what is taking place on the ground, which is basically a violent persecution of the Palestinian people, the Palestinians should be permitted to return to their homes and be compensated for lost or damaged property. I think this resolution was a complete joke because considering what happened, because at the time the damage was already done. Those people were ousted, killed. How are you going to compensate for the people that were brutally killed, murdered, or systematically persecuted? You're not. So it was a joke. It's like they're assuming, the international community here said assumed a mea culpa, where they admit that they did nothing to defend the Palestinian people. The resolution also established the UN Conciliation Commission. Armistices formally ending the war were signed between February and July 1949, but massacres and expulsions of Palestinians continued in 1949 and beyond. So this General Assembly resolution served for nothing, because before that, those massacres were taking place, and after that, the massacres of Palestinians continued to take place. You might say, well, what's the purpose of those General Assemblies? The purpose is that there was an increasing public outcry in regards to the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian situation, because the Palestinian people were being progressively persecuted, massacred, tortured, and subject to ethnic cleansing, torture, psychological terror by the Israeli state. But nobody was talking about that, or very few people, very few states were addressing the issue. Everything was just lobbying for Israel, 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 and silencing all the horrors that the Palestinian people were enduring. So by the end of this war, that initial 1948 war, or Israeli-Arab war, Palestinians was divided and Palestinians were scattered. No shit, Sherlock. So you forcefully displace thousands of populations, you brutally massacred, kill them, you psychologically torture them, you harass them, you commit ethnic cleansing, you forcefully displace them from their territories, you threaten them if they decide to return, and now you have Palestinians scattered everywhere? No shit, Sherlock. Israel held about 78% of Palestine, including the 55% allocated to it by the UN partition plan, and about half of the land allocated for a Palestinian state. So, how can you create a freaking Palestinian state where half of that territory has been completely land grabbed by Israel? What's the next step to create a Palestinian state with 1 square meter? I don't even say if it's 1 square meter of rubble, because then there's also what's happening place in Gaza. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip comprised the remaining half. So, for those that might not know, there were like two essential territories regarding the Arab partition of Palestine, or the so called Palestine state. The West Bank, which you see here on the right, near this Lake Jordan, or the Dead Sea. I don't know if this is the Dead Sea. Well, what is it? I'll just check out in a minute. The Dead Sea. So you have that. And here you have the Gaza Strip, which is this like rectangle, um, thin slice of land bordering the sea, bordering the Mediterranean. And after this, it's Egypt. So this is the Gaza Strip. And those two parcels of land, they should technically be the Palestinian state as per those 1947 um, partitionings. I'm just trying to place the right thing. It was here. I have some pictures here, but that's not the aim. Right. So this is like the West Bank on this side, and here the Gaza Strip. They say uh, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank comprised the remaining half, and were held by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. The capital that was meant to be governed internationally was divided between an Israeli West Jerusalem and a Jordanian-held East Jerusalem. And this is exactly what the Palestinians and the Arab states have been saying. So that the new Palestinian state should have like East Jerusalem as its capital. Well, obviously, West Jerusalem could remain in the so-called Jewish or Palestinian, the Jewish or Israeli state. Excuse, yeah. And they say here, Israel, with its expanded borders, was admitted as a member to the UN in May 1949. So, a very speedy manner, right? About 156,000 Palestinians remain under military rule in Israel, including many internally displaced persons. The approximately 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes, were living in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. None were allowed to return. No Palestinian state was created. So this was the Nakba, the systematic persecution, ethnic cleansing by forceful displacement of Palestinian people from their territories, their original established territories, uh, their subjection to violence, to torture, to massacres, to psychological terror and even psychological warfare, to threats and intimidation. And then you have obviously other uh, post-persecutional periods. So basically, what took place in the Nakba in a certain way continued and intensified. But since this says here until present, we can talk about this. So, martial law period. There was an extensive 20-period year of martial law. The Nakba continued after the end of war in 1949. Remember, the Arab-Israeli War that ecloded just after the creation of the Israeli state on May the 14th, 1948. May the 14th, 1948. Yeah. So Israeli prevented Palestinian refugees outside Israel from returning. Obviously, if the aim was to repopulate the areas where Palestinians were forcefully ousted, they did not want those Palestinians to come back, right? Convenient. Palestinians continued to be expelled, and more Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed, with new Israeli settlements established in their place. Palestinian place names and the name Palestine itself were removed from maps and books. Again, ethnic cleansing Suppression of a people's culture, a people's history, a people's landmarks, everything. Erase the memory of a group of people, which is persecution, another war crime. Massacres of Palestinians also continued after the war. 69 Palestinians were killed in 1953, Kibia massacre. A few years later, 49 Palestinians were killed in the Kafr Qasim massacre on the first day of the 1956 Suez Crisis. Palestinians in Israel remained under strict martial law until 1966. So, how many people exactly were killed on those, let's say, the October the 7th? I'm not here legitimizing those killings because each time there were these massacres, it's like 60, 40, 100. You continue to pile up and some all these killings. And then you see October the 7th killings, and they probably are a fraction of these deaths. So, how many people were killed on October the 7th? 1,000, they say these statistics, 1,195 people were killed by the attacks. 736 Israeli civilians, 79 foreign nationals, 379 members of security forces. Okay. Just killings that we have reported here. And then there were hostages, but not seeing it. So even if this episode you have 1,000 like killings, imagine all these times along history, because I know that some of you don't like to watch history because you're faced and confronted with facts, but some of us do because that allows us to see the truth. In the course of these decades, Israel is probably killing a lot more. Probably no, certainly. It has been killing I don't know how many times more compared to the casualties Israel suffered in that October the 7th attack. This is a fraction. What took place in October the 7th, without diminishing the lives of those people, regarding the Palestinian issue, it was a fraction of the massacres that the Palestinians endured at the hands of the Israeli state. So to claim that the Palestinians are the bad guys and the Israelis are the good ones, you really don't have it right. You're either completely idiot or absolutely corrupt, because that's not what's taking place. That's not what history says. What history says is that the Israelis have been constantly and continuously persecuted, suppressed, and basically wiped out collectively by the Israeli state. And the massacres that the numbers of people massacred in Palestinian states from the Palestinians, and I'm not just talking about those directly killed. I'm talking about the rapes survivors, the psychological torture, the psychological victims of Israel warfare and Israel terror. I'm talking about the people who were forcefully displaced, who, as a result of being forcefully displaced, ended up without means of subsistence and died because they did not have homes, they did not have medicines, they did not have work, they did not have anything. So they were left to die like beggars. I'm also talking about those deaths, not just the formal deaths. What the Palestinian people endured and what the Israeli people endured, what the state of Israel endured is just a drop in the ocean of the full massacres, of the persecution, ethnic cleansing, and systematic repression and persecution that Palestinians have faced. So it comes like, what a surprise that people become like completely shocked each time there is a terrorist attack on Israel, but each time that Israel committed thousands of terrorist genocidal suppression acts against the Palestinian people decades ago, there was little to no action by the international community. And that should be outrageous. That is outrageous. So the people now who are like screaming genocide, genocide in Gaza because of the brutal repression, the brutal aerial bombardments against civilian uh, non-combatant targets by the uh, by the Israel military. I'm not referring to those civilian spots that are used as military combatant areas, but deliberately civil areas or places with people. And they close their eyes at the genocides and the systematic persecution, repression, and brutality exercised over the Palestinian people by the Israeli state over decades. They're hypocrites. Not those who are speaking about all these issues time and time ago, and also are speaking naturally against the genocide taking place in the Gaza Strip, particularly, with those aerial bombardments and carpet bombardments by Israel. But before we come to this 2025 period, let's just finish this part here, because this is a very long story to understand what took place uh, with the Palestinian this Palestinian issue and the Israel issue, as well as the the story of conflict that arose since this division of the territory of the former Palestinian administered colony of the United Kingdom into an Arab state that should be Palestine and the Jewish state of which should be Israel. It was contentious, and Israel did just the wrong part, because even before the very formal creation of Israel, the already would be inheritors of that Israeli state decided to expel and forcefully displace, persecute, and brutalize, and even kill, obviously, and massacre hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And these patterns of systematic persecutions, of repression, brutality, of controlling, monitoring, and repressing every single aspect of Palestinians' people's lives, it continued as a pattern by the Israeli states over decades, with the systematic aim of deprive the Palestinian people of the lands where they originally lived, deprive them of the means of subsistence, humiliate, torture them, brutalize them, exercise terror, psychological warfare, terror, um, and strip them of their identity, to collectively persecute them and to suppress their identity as Palestinian people. Now we have here this a little bit more recent period, not until the most recent. There was this Nakba period, so other wars probably during the 1967 Six-Day Wars. So yes, another Arab-Israeli war. This one was the third one. The result is always the same. Israel won that war, and it kept expanding. And each time it won a war against the neighboring Arab states, it kept grabbing a combination of existing Arab states' territory. They take like a little bit more of land, and they take a little bit more of would-be territories to be assigned to the Arab Palestinian state. Amazing. They say here, during this war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees were driven from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So another forceful deportation of the people who lived there. Most were driven into Jordan. This had become known as the Al-Aqsa, the setback. After the war, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So this West Bank and Gaza Strip have not been immaculate territories. They have been already occupied by Israel long before. Now they are being occupied, but they already were occupied. Some 2,000 Palestinians were killed in a massacre led by the Lebanese Front at the siege of Daraa during the Lebanese Civil War. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon were killed or displaced during the Lebanon War. including between 800 and 3,500 killed in the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Basically, the Palestinian peoples were like collateral damages in the regional wars because Israel also had wars with Lebanon during that time, and there was the Lebanese civil war, and Israel intervened there. And the Palestinians that were killed were like collateral damages in the midst. Okay, accidental killings, but nevertheless they take place. So you see, if it's not being killed by Israel in, let's dispute against the territories that it wanted to take over, it's if they don't die due to disputes of territorial lands between Israel and the so-called Arab Palestinian state, these Palestinian people die as a result of bombings between Israel and other neighboring Arab states as collateral damages by Israeli force, mainly, obviously. And then you have here a more radicalizing period since 1987. So the first Intifada, basically, it's kind of like a call for arms. It's a call of rage. So what was happening is that each time there was these calls by the Palestinian people, it's like a call for nationalism or patriotism, where they feel like they're being suppressed by the Israeli state, their identity is being destroyed, it's being collectively shattered, and this idea that if Palestinians do not unite under war and they don't take up violence, uh, their culture is going to die and disappear, because it's the realization that the diplomatic means for a peaceful solution so that they can coexist with Israel is gone, and in that kind of mentality. So they need to radicalize to defend the existence and the survival of the Palestinian culture and identity against the so-called against the Israeli threat, who want to systematically persecute, suppress, and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people. So that's the motivation for this radicalization from certain sectors of Palestinian people. This take up of arms is in the forms of riots, civil protests, terrorist attacks, disobedience, anything from non-violence to basically riots and to even terrorist attacks. It depends on the spectrum of the political society, but it's essentially a rage cauldron where people do not feel, the Palestinians people, they do not feel that their demands for the respect of Palestinian culture and Palestinian state and their identity was not being ensured by the Israelis. On the contrary, they were systematically persecuting and suppressing them. And so they had to organize themselves, and they feel that they had to organize themselves under either non-violent to even violent protests, because that was like the only way. It's like you're cornering someone between the wall. They will eventually react, right? This is like what they have been doing. And there were several of these intifadas. This was like the first one, but there were more. The first intifada began in 1987 and lasted until the 1993 Oslo Accords. Then there was a second intifada in 2000 because of the occupation of other Palestinian lands by Israeli. They say here it started as a civilian uprising in Jerusalem, and Israel then responded with extreme violence, killing over 100 Palestinian protesters. So each time there was like a call of anger from the Palestinian people or the youth, the Palestinian uh, society organizes, they protest, non-violence or even violent protests, riots, whatever. Israel responds, suppresses the protests, uses violence, and it's a never-ending snowball of violence, because then after that, the Palestinians radicalize, or groups of radical people, factions in the Palestinian societies, radicalize and defend more violent attacks against Israel and the use of terrorist attacks. Israel responds to those terrorist attacks by carrying out attacks against Palestinian people. Then, as a result, there are more deaths in the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people retaliate by having an even more radicalizing society, and the existing terrorist groups fuel even more rage. and fuel the need for more terrorist attacks against Israel. So they carry out those terrorist attacks against Israel. Israel suffers those terrorist attacks, and then it decides to retaliate against the Palestinian people. So it's a never ending snowball. You can see where this leads to. Violence here just doesn't lead to any sort of positive outcome. But the problem is not the Intifada per se. It's like the Intifada rose because the demands, the legitimate aspirations for the Palestinians to have a society, a state in which they can peacefully live, develop themselves, and, you know, try to make their lives respectfully, they could not have that. Their culture was and is being suppressed, systematically suppressed, and they're being systematically targeted by the Israeli state, who want to dismantle every single state of their culture, of their identity. And that's exactly what led the Palestinian people to feel that if they would just continue to just disagree with what Israel was doing and doing nothing, not rioting, not protesting, not resorting to more robust opposition techniques from nonviolence to violence, then they feel that they would just simply die and wither. And this call of intifada was like a call of a desperate call that if the Palestinian people would not fight for themselves, they would not fight for their independence, then nobody else would. Then everybody else in the international community would just watch them being systematically suppressed, targeted, persecuted, and ethnically cleansed. And people would just not do anything, or the international community would just say, oh, we condemn that, but they would not do anything to prevent or defend the Palestinian people. And this need of the Intifada rose because the Palestinian people came to the conclusion that if they would not take matters to their own hands, nobody else would. So the people that in Palestine did radicalize themselves, they did not radicalize themselves out of the blue or because of a sunny day or because Israel decided to exist. It was not because of that. They radicalized because the context of the society, the geopolitics of the region at the time, led them to be left out without any options, where either they would radicalize for the defense of Palestine and their culture and their identity, or they would be completely wiped out and they would be suppressed, completely suppressed. So obviously, uh, this is sad because you say, okay, people should not resort to violence. But the same people who say that people should not resort to violence, they should also say people should not resort to violence if they have means to solve an issue without violence, if they can solve the issues peacefully. What if they don't? Then, if you say people cannot resort to violence, you're only going to feel more violence because, as you can see, it's like certain subjects, like you try to solve without you try to solve things normally and without violence. When violence comes, it is only because there is not a peaceful way out. Because one of the sides is not willing to want to compromise. They don't want. And that's exactly what leads to violence. So here we're just explaining a bit like the genesis of this radicalizations every time they took place, because there were several intifadas, as you can see. And then the result is generally more deaths, more killings from each side, from Israeli and also from the Palestinian side. It's basically a lose-lose scenario. But it's the scenario that has been taking place because of the context that leads to radicalization. And again, I keep saying that this radicalization could stop immediately, or at least it could eventually subside if the principle would be of peaceful coexistence. But that principle has not existed because Israel has been systematically targeting the people of Palestine, the Palestinian people, even before the creation of the State of Israel, and it continues that pattern. Decades pass, but the same methods of repression, control, torture, terror of con- psychological terror of Palestinian people continues. Those massacres in the early days were obviously more extensive and more visible, but they still continue now. this persecution, this ethnic cleansing, this suppression of Palestinian identity. And this is something that, as international community, we need to condone. We cannot be connivant with these behaviors because this attitude of Israel has fueled a cauldron for more radicalization by the Palestinian society and by the more radical fringe groups of such society. Because when people are left with no hope, they turn to violence. And you, those Palestinian, those people who pushed the Palestinian people to violence, you are at fault. These people don't choose violence just because they're violent people. They don't choose violence because in the day they woke and they chose violence. They chose because they were forced to. Because the repression, the systematic persecution that was carried out by the Israeli state over the Palestinian collective identity lead those people to no choice. And as a result, it was this radicalization of the Palestinian society, the terrorist organizations, the terrorist attacks, and this brutal wave of never-ending violence, this brutal spiraling snowball of violence that never stopped since then. There could be a way to stop this, and that would be the peaceful coexistence, but I had never seen that since the creation of the State of Israel. The periods of peace were always very brief, and every time there was like ceasefire of peace, it's just like uh, a moment where hostilities formally are paused, but the war still lingers. The people still hate each other. Like the you still see the hatred of the radical people in Palestine against the Israeli actions because you don't have the main causes of this conflict suppressed. You don't have the main causes of this conflict addressed, which were the recognition that the Palestinians should have the right to uh, maintain their culture, their identity, and to live in their territory peacefully and in respect with other cultures. And that right has been completely denied because they're systematically persecuted by Israel. They've been systematically brutalized, subjected to psychological warfare, terror, and suppression of their main of their basic civic rights by Israel. And one of those aspects were like the checkpoints. If you remember, like from the 2000s, Palestinians who lived on the West Bank and on Gaza wanted to work on Israel. They had to face a battery of checkpoints, of hardships every time they wanted to work in Israel. They could not live in Israel, no. They had to return back to Gaza, the West Bank, each day. But they basically they were like in a way controlled like cattle. And so basically, what kind of life is that, right? The Palestinians having their main rights suppressed, being treated kind of like as slaves or persecuted, harassed, constantly, uh, constantly like under watch and under repression by Israeli authorities. They obviously are not going to like that, and naturally they will feel like the need to revolt because they have not been having the right to exist with their identity, to defend their own culture. This is one of the issues regarding the Palestinian people. So you have here other things. Uh, what else? In the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Israel built, this is in 2005, the West Bank barrier. So like this gigantic wall, a giant wall barrier between Israel and the so-called Palestinian territories. And the idea was like to the separate the people of Israel from the people of Palestine. Like it's like a ghetto. If you probably understand like what's been happening in Gaza, at least since then, there has been this ghettoization of Gaza, similar or likewise in a way that Warsaw was treated as a ghetto. The ghetto of Warsaw and Warsaw was treated by the Nazis. It's similar, the systematic civic suppression of rights of people who live in the Gaza Strip to make their life as hellish and hard as possible, to basically, cut their existence and persecute the Palestinian people as well as their collective identity to suppress the Palestinian people collectively. So we have here, uh, after that, in 2011, Israel passed the Nakba law, which denies government funding to institutions that commemorate the Nakba. This sounds like something positive because at least you're trying to address the root causes of this conflict. You're trying to not stir more violence into the situation at the time, right? Or, well, actually, no. This let's check this thing more carefully. Ah, okay, I get it. Uh, when you say you commemorate the Nakba, it's the other way around. So actually, this was a wrong thing. The Nakba law, which is like with the creation of Israel, thousands of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands were displaced forcefully, and as a result, that was the Nakba, right? The tragedy of the forceful displacement and the initial persecution and brutality of Israel against the Palestinian people with a genocide or ethnical cleansing. And they say here that any entity that tries to recall the Nakba or tries to recall that forceful displacement of populations that was subjected to government funding would be denied funding. It's like being subjected to censorship. If you speak about the Nakba, if you open your mouth about the Nakba, about the persecution and the terror and the violence that the Palestinians were subjected to, of the 350,000 plus Palestinians that were forcibly displaced during that period, at least, we're going to cut your funding. So again, extortion, not extortion. This is how you call it, blackmailing. It's blackmailing. The government blackmailing uh, entities in the civil society or entities that would receive government funding of withholding any funds if they would speak about the Nakba. It's like you open your mouth about the Nakba situation. If you don't keep your mouth shut, if you don't talk about that, we're going to cut your funding. Intimidation and threatening, right? Because you needed to bury the truth and cancel the crimes and the genocides against the Palestinian people. Again, bad. So the 2023 Gaza war has caused the highest Palestinian casualties since the 1948 war and has raised fears. Okay, that's exactly what took place. So now this comes with the present. There was the October the 7th attack, the attack of Hamas in the midst of this Palestinian issue. And this attack of Hamas, uh, obviously, it's okay. That's just a thing. Okay. This attack of Hamas, it basically led to the killing of at least 1,000 people. It was horrible. We obviously condemned. I obviously condemned like the killing of people just by the killing of people. But looking at this, there was something even darker that arose from this. Israel used these attacks and the terror and the people that were killed as a pretext to conduct a campaign of genocide and orchestration against the Palestinian people. So this was the real problem. Exactly after this October the 7th attacks with killings on that day and obviously kidnappings, you see here about 250 civilians and soldiers were taken as hostages to the Gaza Strips. And obviously the hostages, because the hostages situation continues until present. Some were killed, some died in captivity, some died by Israeli bombings, some died by because they were killed, others were freed, and eventually others even perished before they came to captivity. So there's a whole bunch of things, and some we don't even know where they are, if they're alive or not, because even Hamas might have lost track of the exact placement or the exact location. They might like know separately, but then after some weeks, their groups might be subject to attacks, and they don't hear anything about them during a certain period, and they don't even know if they're alive or not. So in the midst of this confusion, after this October the 7th attacks, which obviously a terrorist attack by a terrorist attack should be condemnable because of the use of violence against civilians, yes, formally speaking. The problem is that Israel used these things as a pretext to launch a war of aggression and carry out a systematic campaign of genocide, reinforce the campaign of genocide against the Palestinians. Since then, it has carried out systematic bombings and targetings of the Gaza Strips, of basically an area that is like 60 to 80% populated. It's not a very long area. I don't know how much. What's the approximate square meters of the Gaza Strip? 21 miles long. Uh, so this 365 square kilometers, or 141 square miles. That's a very small parcel of land. It's smaller than the state of New Jersey. Like the state of New Jersey is Israel. What the heck? It's not even like it's one city or two. So what can we say about this? Okay, October the 7th. Okay. Essentially, the until now, after this October the 7th massacre, which obviously was heinous, what happens is that Israel decided to uh, start a war of aggression, a campaign of terror, and of brutal repression against the Palestinian people in Gaza, under the pretext of attacking the perpetrators of October the 7th attacks and their allies. Obviously, it was Hamas who assumed um, the authorship of those terrorist attacks. Israel first carried out retaliatory strikes over the Gaza Strip, allegedly to target military infrastructures and combatant places. I mean, formally until here, it sounds like normal, right? Tit for tat. If you attack our civilians, we as a state are going to defend that. We're going to um, we're going to use our military means to protect our civilians, uh, to exercise justice against the people who committed the terrorist attacks. In principle, this sounds well. This sounds normal. I mean, you attack civilians of a country, then you expect retaliations from that country, right? If a state attacks civilians from a country out of nowhere, then that country, the other country will retaliate, right? But the thing here is Israel, under the pretext of attacking military infrastructure and military targets, Hamas or other terrorist organizations in the Gaza Strip, they ended up killing Palestinian people. Sorry, that was just a hiccup. They ended up killing Palestinian people. So they targeted largely densely populated areas. You can see here that Gaza, it's essentially a group of cities, or was a group of cities, because if you would look at now today, looking at the news, this is just rubble from coast to coast, from side to side. It's mainly just rubble and destruction. It's an entire parking lot, unfortunately. But it was not like that a few years ago. So you see Gaza International Airport destroyed, non-operational since 2002. Um, what happens is that even if people want to get by Gaza, they just need, the only way is to get from Israel's internal border. They cannot get by land. They cannot get by sea, because Israel patrols the zone with like a blockade, and stops it stops the people from coming from the seaside. The only people that can definitely use the sea are like the fishermen, the fishing ships, and for those there still is a fishing limit. You see here 6 nautical miles, which is like probably 30 kilometers or something. There is a greater fishing line, but here basically it's a lot restrictive. The people in Gaza have had their life fully conditioned, and the only way to get to Gaza is from Israel, or was from Israel. There is no other access, because all the other access to Gaza have been closed, mostly. Then there are some areas like here, Rafah, Kerem Shalom. Well, there are some areas through which um, the access by land can be possible, but always under Israeli checkpoint control, and these checkpoints controls are limited. They they don't function the whole time. They might have been subjected to restrictions. So, for example, this Beit Hanun, the Israel authorities operate this crossing 6 days per week for authorized internationals and Palestinians holding Israeli exit permits. Only limited categories of people are eligible for such permits. So this is not a crossing that anybody can use. It's a very limited strip here. And you also see that the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel is actually, Gaza is like a prison, because you have here observation tower, a no-go and high-risk zone. So essentially, if somebody tries to cross this, they will probably be shot. They will be shot. Underground concrete barrier in case they decide to just come out. An observation tower. So it's basically an impossible kind of obstacles to be crossed by a single or a group of Palestinian people without being spotted. And obviously, if they're spotted, they'll probably be shot, right? If they try to enter the so-called lethal areas. Then you have here other crossing points. Rafah, the one is, that has been very widely used for humanitarian access from the side of Egypt. They operate this crossing 5 days per week for the entire entry and exit of passengers and goods. Essentially, it operates on weekdays. And here, Kerem Shalom, they operate the story 5 days per week for the entire entry and exit of authorized goods. Apart from that, it's impossible to get in Gaza. You cannot get by air, you cannot get by sea, you can only get by the land controlled by other states, and essentially by Israel. Israel controls most of the access to the Gaza Strip. Nothing comes in or comes out of the Gaza Strip without the consent of Israel. And that's exactly the problematic of creating the Palestinian state. Because how can the Palestinian people, who have been, by the way, subjected to horrendous bombings, torture, violence, persecution, killings, indiscriminate targeting of civilians here on the Gaza Strip by Israeli bombings, and even starvation. Starvation has been used as a weapon of war here against the Palestinian people. Another means to persecute and systematically suppress and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people, because famine just by famine did not happen by accident. It happens because the Israeli authorities wanted the Palestinian people to suffer. And it's not about Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. That's not true. The suppression of humanitarian assistance was a means to make the Palestinian people suffer, to increase the psychological torture and suffering of Palestinian people, and use starvation as a means to kill, obviously, the weaker Palestinian people, and to even lead them to a greater desperation and a sense of uh, loss of purpose. And that's obviously war crime, to use famine, to use hunger as weapons of war. This is what Israel has been using across the entire Gaza Strip over the Palestinian people. People who had no choice about if Hamas was there or Hamas was not there. Another thing is, if, for example, civilian infrastructures or formerly non-combating infrastructures like hospitals and schools have been used by Hamas as combatant or command and control centers. Of course, that's a problem. Obviously, that's also a war crime. But the problem here is, what about the Palestinian people? They're like collateral damages in between this war. And Israel says we will not leave this situation until either we get all our hostages or either we exterminate all Hamas. They perfectly know that you cannot exterminate an ideology or group. If you continue to pour in violence, you're going to generate even more violence there. So it's a political statement of falseness, where Israel is just doing that to for some political internal consumption against the more fanatical groups who want to keep their war on terror against Hamas just for political gains, especially in what concerns Netanyahu, who, by the way, has an international warrant by the International Criminal Court for the crimes committed in Gaza, as well as the defense minister and other entities. These people are not innocent. They have been politically issuing orders and military orders to their commanders to carry out systematic persecution, bombings, and killings of civilians, carpet bombings of civilians, of civilian areas, civilian infrastructures, carrying out, instrumentalizing famine as a weapon of war, persecuting and harassing Palestinians, with the purpose to ethnically cleanse or suppress the Palestinian identity and lead to the wiping out of the Palestinian people. This from the state that so-called vowed to exterminate Hamas because of Hamas wanting to wiping out Israel. But the Palestinian people, what about the Palestinian people again? Because Hamas is just being used as a weapon for Israel's purpose. The people of Israel continue to be persecuted and harassed just like before the foundation of the state of Israel. But now it's even worse. Now it's genocide every day with bombings of civilians, bombings of refugee camps in Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah. You see all the news, right? Those refugee camps. And it's saddening that you see people lining up to get basic food. They need to scramble just to get uh, perhaps a little bit of rice or a little bit of some lentils or whatever. Like huge families who have lost their homes to bombings, to Israel bombings and Israel carpet bombings. They have no place to go. You cannot just send them, oh, we go from this place, move to somewhere else. They have nowhere to go because everything in the Gaza Strip is mainly destroyed. More than 80% is destroyed, and the infrastructure is unusable. Israel knows that. Israel knows that in its war against Hamas, it is exterminating the Palestinian people. It knows that the Palestinian people are being used as collateral damage and doesn't give a crap. Because the priority of the current Israel authorities and the current Israel government is we don't care about the Palestinian people. If they cared, they would perfectly know that using of terror and force against Hamas, using of terror and force against the Palestinian people is not the way. So we probably could have understood a reaction of Israel against Hamas militarily, like if they would have struck in a similar way like Lebanon, and then they would just contain themselves. But no, they decided to use that Hamas attack as a pretext to unfold a campaign of orchestrated, planned, carefully, deliberately planned, and orchestrated genocide of Palestinian people. I mean, it's sad. These people didn't have the choice to choose if they were Palestinians or not. They were born there. They decided to just, they happened to be born there through no fault of their own. And they are being systematically persecuted, tortured, and brutalized by a state who decides that it's okay to carpet bomb them. It's okay to exercise genocide, repression, use famine as weapons of war, and to just carpet bomb them, even targeting humanitarian aid convoys. This is the kind of things that is not just shocking for the international, but not shocking in the sense of inaction. It's outrageous. And it's exactly what has been leading the international community to stand firm in the defense of the need for a state for the Palestinians and the need for a state for the Palestinian people and the state of Palestine. Not just about the state of Israel, the need to have a state where Palestinian people can live in dignity, peacefully coexist and make their lives. And this is not happening right now. Sure, there was this international recognition. A lot of states have just publicly out denouncing and publicly outcrying the brutality and the massacre that has been unfolding on the Palestinian people on uh, on the Gaza Strip. But it's not enough. You just cannot just say you just cannot say no. We recognize the Palestinian state, and everything is going to be fine. Yesterday there were genocides and systematic targetings of Palestinians, carpet bombings of civilian infrastructures as well, and of civilians, civilian killings and murders, and even journalists were murders. By the way, were murdered by Israel, claiming that they were terrorists in the building. Well, they also managed to kill journalists as collateral damages. Wow, what a surprise. That is still killing of journalists. So it's just not enough to, we recognize the state of Israel and the issue of the genocide of Israel. We recognize the state of Palestine and the state and the genocide of Israel against the Palestinians is completely dealt with. This is not this question does not simply end with the mere recognition, the mere formal recognition of the state Palestine, the state of Palestine in a General Assembly. So although we have this map here where so many countries overwhelmingly now recognize the state of Palestine, and there are still a few that do not, namely the United States, Japan, and you have here Germany, Italy. I think this is Myanmar, right? But this is like a junta, so don't care. Finland, you have Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, Greece, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Andorra. So there are a few resistance here. But in spite of the majority of states here in the international community overwhelmingly recognize the state of Palestine, this issue is just not enough. Because with territories like this, with less than what 141 square miles for this, and about this one, the West Bank, 2,000 square miles. I don't see how you can create just a functional state. Maybe on the West Bank, the West Bank seems to have like a decent territory. I mean, obviously, territory does not mean that you have a lot of resources in that territory, but you know, it seems more practical than the West, than the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip doesn't look like viable for a state. But still, the point comes to the same. Even if we do recognize the existence of a Palestinian state between West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state, such recognition is useless if the Palestinian people cannot live in peace and unharmed and to peacefully develop themselves. Because they're under threat, aggression, or the imminent threat or the imminent aggression by Israel. This is something that has to be addressed because it's not just by the recognition of the independence of a country that it simply solve this. So basically, now to finish this and wrap this up, because this is obviously a long discussion, but an interesting one in my opinion, and more interesting than many stupid subjects that you see these days, because we have the choice to either fill ourselves with stupid content or decide to actually learn something a little bit more interesting from time to time that actually can be useful. And this is the kind of choice I propose you here in my occasional streams. Very occasional because I obviously have not been doing this for a long time. I'm just wanting to see when was that General Assembly, or at least that there was this General Assembly on the UN from basically September the 8th or until like the 28th, where basically the main thing was to recognize the state of Palestine, and a lot of states during this month of September have recognized the existence of a state of Palestine. Basically, I'll try to see here. Oops, sorry. Countries that have recognized recognition Palestine. Yeah, with this international recognition of Palestine. Okay, we can end here with this particular subject. Uh, it's quite a long one, but I think we have addressed some of the issues here. It's a difficult one, but I would rather address this than some clown idiocy in clown world. So you see here that by now, of 193 members of the UN, 156 have recognized the state of Palestine, over 80%. Okay. Over 80% have recognized. And by the way, because there is another body in the UN, which is the UN Security Council, which is basically like the executive of UN. It's like the government of the state. In this case, the government of the UN, which is responsible to enforce the decisions made by the General Assembly, the resolutions by the General Assembly. It is made of a group of members, obviously, like any organization, any body within a government structure of representatives. And the representatives of the UN Security Council have permanent and non-permanent members. I think there are 10 non-permanent members, and then there are 5 permanent members. Whatever. There's like non-permanent, and the permanent members I know are 5, which are China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Yeah, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and US. These are the 5 permanent members in the UN Security Council. They can be important because obviously they have veto power, which means that in order for something to be enforceable, let's say by the UN Security Council, then a resolution needs to be adopted by the majority of the countries in the UN Security Council, and it cannot have veto from any permanent member. So it's not enough to have a majority for a resolution to pass in the UN Security Council. You also need to have the non-disagreement of every permanent member. So since every permanent member, like China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and US, have veto power, if any of these would not recognize the state of Palestine, and there would be like a proposal to enforce a resolution recognizing the state of Palestine, what happens is that if one of those states, for example, imagine the United States decides to exercise veto power regarding the recognition of the state of Palestine, then basically the UN Security Council cannot enforce uh, the UN General Assembly resolution that recognizes the state of Palestine. Now, don't get me wrong. This does not mean that the state of Palestine does not exist because of a capricious exercise of veto power by a UN security member. No, that doesn't change the facts. The state has already been recognized by a large majority of members in the international community. So by this time, there is a state of Palestine, either you like it or not. Now, some countries decide to recognize, some decide to not recognize, some countries decide to only recognize it after a certain period of time. It's the usual thing because a recognition of a state generally does not happen overnight. And it might take years, but eventually it happens. By this time, we've seen this, for example, with Kosovo in the 1990s, and there are many other examples of newly created states where it took time. And the same happens now with Palestine, but Palestine already has a huge, overwhelming majority. 80% of UN members already agreed to that. So it's too late for those who decide to uh, not decide on the issue, expecting that by delaying this issue of recognizing the Palestinian state or not, or by refusing to recognize the state of Palestine, that such state will not exist. It exists already. In the international community, it is already existence, whether you like it or not. And if you need to suppress the existence of the state of Palestine, or you need to cancel the issue, you're just making yourself a fool because it exists. Now, countries, due to some other priorities, or because they want to make sure that they are talking with the right political interlocutors, they might delay that recognition of the state of Palestine. In that case, it makes sense because they want to make sure that the state of Palestine is led by like democratic or moderate forces uh, who do not defend a terrorist rhetoric, but rather an appeasement or a conciliation, not an appeasement, I don't like that word, a conciliation rhetoric, a peaceful coexistence rhetoric with the neighboring countries in the region, and the idea to use their resources to their peaceful development. And in that case, to delay the recognition of such state makes sense. But to refuse or delay the recognition of such state on the premise that it's just not the right moment yet, that's just an excuse. Then when is the right moment to recognize the state of Palestine? After every Palestinian in the Gaza Strip has been wiped out, exterminated, due to bombings, due to disease, sickness, due to the mistreatment, due to the lack of medicines, due to the lack of humanitarian aid access, because Israel cuts those international humanitarian aid. When is the right moment? When every single of these Palestinians have been buried by 20 kilotons of rubble, and all their buildings have been destroyed, or when the entire Palestinian people have been wiped out because they've died by famine, hunger, or diseases associated with hunger. Because, especially for those in the medical fields, that if if those people are suffering from malnutrition, they are suffering from malnutrition, from disease, from sickness, they're also more propensous to become even more sick and more vulnerable and more immunodepressive and more subjected to even more diseases and more deaths because they're malnourished. I mean, when is the right moment to recognize the state of Palestine? Every single day, Israel is carrying out a systematic repression against the Palestinian people, killing, murdering civilians, not combatants. It might kill combatants, we are not disputing that, but uh, it is still attacking civilians. It is still killing civilians. That doesn't mean that we cannot condemn the use of civilians as weapons of war, the use of civilians as human shields by Hamas. Of course, that is also condemnable, but Israel is not doing any part. It's also Israel is only making things worse by committing war crimes due to deliberately targeting civilian populations, deprive them of food, deprive them of medicines, and to systematically persecute them. So I think the moment for the recognition of the state of Palestine, if it has not been yet, it is now. Because these people have been suffering unimaginable horrors and terrors. And the least the international community can do is acknowledge that what the Palestinian people have been forced to endure, not since October the 7th, since before the creation of the state of Palestine, generationally speaking, has been beyond cruelty and inhumane. And by the way, there are many Palestinians and many Palestinian people who are suffering these kinds of repressions and torture. I'm not talking about collective people, but individuals around the world that have been subject to torture, brutality, and repression, particularly in the state I live, and I include myself. And as any sane person, I cannot agree with the horrors and violence that has been committed on the Palestinian people. They have the right to live on their land peacefully, to be unharmed, to be respected, to be allowed to coexist peacefully and pursue happiness, I guess, like any other of us. But they have not been having that. They have been systematically tortured and persecuted. I also have been tortured by other means. Just because I'm talking to you, that doesn't mean I've not been subjected to some horror or terrible cruelties. It's just that I'll be against any horror or cruelty or torture against innocent people anywhere. Maybe this situation of Palestine comes on the news, but many other situations don't come on the news. And I would like to also address those because I just don't accept to see genocide in Gaza every day. Just like I don't accept to have people, individuals in countries being tortured And when they file complaints of torture, the judicial system silences them and how do you say, um, buries their complaints so that they do not come out, and prevents those complaints from reaching the public sphere, where even journalists stop and prevent divulging cases of torture. I live in such a country. The difference is that the situations of Palestine is of public knowledge. It is visible in open eyes. There are many hidden situations of torture, and either it be visible or non-visible, either because it's not just because a situation of brutality, of repression, and inhumane treatment appears on TV that I'm against it. And how many other situations of cruel and inhumane treatment, abuse, and torture do not appear on TV and take place, of course. But anyway, this was just for the Palestinian people um, and the state of Palestine. You know, this was a subject long overdue. Uh, on a curious side note, when the Israeli representative went to the United Nations and making his speech, a lot of countries went out of the room. As soon as he started to speak, the other countries in the room just civilly raised themselves up, they stood up, and they left the room. I mean, I understand they had to go shop for groceries, right? They had to uh, go to the bathroom. They had to get some fresh air outside or smoke or whatever, right? Because they had lives. And certainly, probably the person who was representing the state of Israel forgot that the thousands of Palestinians that he has killed with his orders of bombings and systematic bombings of Palestinian civilians also had lives, and not just Hamas people. But I guess he had not to worry because, there was no warrant by the International Criminal Court when he went to the United Nations, right? Because he could not be arrested there. At least he was not facing those charges of genocide there. And it's just sad that this situation is allowed to take place in regards to Palestine. There are many Palestinians in this world, but for all those who feel what's happening there and the horrors that these people have been forced to live, we all have to be Palestine. We all feel Palestine. If you are not Palestine, it means that you are complacent with the killings, the genocide, the brutality, and the sufferings that the Palestinian people have been enduring. But because I'm not a hypocritical person that just focuses on these main press issues, I remind you that there are many other issues that not just the Palestinian genocide and that are not being openly talked about. So if you decide to talk about the Palestinian issue to not talk about the others, you're a hypocrite yourself. I'm against any of these situations of inhumane treatment regarding Palestine. Obviously, we need to wait how things will process if effectively one day the Palestinians finally might live in peace. But that day is not coming to today. The same goes with me. I'm not being able to make my life peacefully. I've been stopped from that. I don't. It is not a result of free will, because if it was, how many things I would have changed. But still, this is like the current world situation regarding Palestine. I'm not sure when the next stream will be, but I think this is comprehensive. It is difficult, a difficult type of streams, but nevertheless, I felt the moral obligation to address this because, I think it still was a positive development that many states finally decided to rise up and recognize the state of Palestine because during 10 or 20 years, a lot of these states were just silent and they were not speaking about. the horrors that Palestinian people were enduring. And finally, although I understand that the genocide against the Palestinians that is being carried out by Israel, and those bombings alleged against Hamas combatant targets, they're in fact uh, killing and brutalizing Palestinian people as collateral damages as a result, or as direct damages. It's a systematic murder of Palestinians. It is genocide. And I think as international community, that violence must stop. We must all fully condemn the violence that Israel is carrying out in Palestine and in the Gaza Strip and against the Palestinian people. We must vehemently condemn every use of force against civilians and the systematic repression, brutality, and persecution against civilians, the Palestinian civilians, and the Palestinian population. Let's see how the next months give, for this new Palestinian state. But for now, I just don't see an immediate change of things. I mean, ultimately, what I see is if this trend of persecution and systematic aggression and targeting of Palestinians continues, you'll have a further increase of pressure by the international community against Israel in the form of boycotts, boycotts against Israel, Israeli products, Israeli companies, Israeli investments, boycotts of Israeli tourism, boycotts of Israel associated things, boycotts of trade agreements, and even exiting of trade agreements. And even to the worst case scenario, complete isolation. Basically, Israel is on the verge of becoming a pariah state if this systematic behavior of aggression against the Palestinians continues. I'm not talking about the civic society in Israel, because right now they're completely unable to change the dynamics of the representatives of power in Israel. They're completely unable to change that. And there has been a genocide that has been systematically carried out and orchestrated by the Israeli government and those specific figures against Palestinian people, Palestinian civilians. So while this doesn't change, I don't see a change from the international community in regards the increasing pressure against Israel, increasing boycott of Israel, of its products, its services, trade agreements, and even boycotting the presence of Israel and Israel-like entities in international organizations, namely sport events, specifically sport events. It could be football, it could be uh, what else? The World Championships, the Olympic Games, anything, and even Eurovision, anything. And no matter how much pressure Israel decides to do or lobbying, even if the United States or one or another country decides to continue to play the clown regarding what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip, it's not going to work, because that pressure is only going to mount and only going to increase. I think it's also revealing if you have people being arrested for carrying out Palestinian flags. Because if in other countries, specifically countries that have not recognized Palestine, you see people being arrested because they carry a Palestinian flag, or people being deported because they carry a Palestinian flag, that is also a problem of Israel. And that will lead to further increase of pressure against Israel. So the international community is watching. Then we'll see how it goes. But I do not foresee anything positive against Israel if what has been taking place continues the next day. If the bombings continue, Israel will face hell, nightmare in terms of international pressure. And I'm sure that this is not what the people in Israel want, but the government is controlling it. It says the shit it wants. It does the shit it wants. They don't care. They don't give a fuck about the international conventions. They don't give a fuck about war crimes. They don't give a fuck about that. And this is a sad statement of affairs we live in. But there will be more other topics that I might be discussing, but for now, this is all for me. Palestinian issue has been discussed, and with a more positive note. And by the way, I'm not here to be your positive person. I'm not here to be positive or negative. I'm being to be truthful. And I personally detest people who need to be positive the whole time, because if you need to be positive, it means that you do not accept people that sometimes cannot be positive. And I think we need to be truthful. That's the most important thing. So I leave you with this Palestinian flag. It might actually bring some hope that maybe someday the Palestinians get the recognition they deserve and the respect they deserve, which they have not been getting. And by Palestinians, I don't just mean the people in Palestine. I mean, we all are Palestinians, those who have been silenced, suppressed, tortured, abused, whatever. And signing off for now. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a long one, a long, uh, a long little stream, but at least I think you can definitely learn something about it. So I will see you the next time. I don't know when. It might be a very long time. If I see some subject worthy of discussion, I might address it. Uh, I wish you I wish you have like a good week or good weeks ahead until I return. And as usual, it's important to be critic of the events that take place in the world, because if we just like are people who look at our phones and look like zombies to our phone and don't think anything about what's going on, we're just making things worse. So signing off for now, and I wish you a good day.